Some predators wear badges. Others wear shadows. But the worst, they wear both. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where each story is darker than the last, and the truth is more chilling than fiction. Thank you for tuning in. Your time means a lot to me. But here's the thing. Not everyone is subscribing, liking, or commenting. These stories deserve more than just silent views. They deserve an engaged community. Whether you're watching from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, South Africa, Canada, the Philippines, the United Kingdom, or anywhere else, please hit subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Every click, like, and comment counts. Together, we can give these stories the attention they deserve. Thanks for being part of this journey. The year was 1999, and Pretoria's Capital Park suburb wasn't just dying. It was being harvested. Bodies appeared like terrible offerings, scattered across railway tracks and empty fields, each one stripped of dignity, life, and identity. The women were sex workers, invisible to a society that had already erased them long before their murders. And so the killing continued, month after month, because who mourns the forgotten? But there was someone watching, someone hunting, and when detectives finally cornered their nightmare, they discovered something that would shatter the very foundation of justice itself. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, wearing the uniform meant to protect. His name was Sidney Samuel, and he didn't just take lives. He studied them, savored them, turned murder into a ritual that would claim at least 9 women, though the true number may be far higher. Tonight, we're stepping into the mind of a monster who understood one chilling truth. The best place to hide a body is in a graveyard, and the best place to hide a killer is behind a badge. This is the story of how trust became the sharpest weapon, how authority became a mask for evil, and how the very people sworn to protect became the ones you should fear most. Welcome to the nightmare of the Capital Park serial killer. Stopwatch equals 0.5s. I know many of you come here to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for 4 chilling true crime stories, each darker than the last. So, get cozy, let go of your day, and before you start to daze off, please take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now let feast. Capital Park sprawled across Pretoria's western edge like a wound that refused to heal. By 1999, the suburb had become a patchwork of contradictions. Modest family homes pressed against industrial wastelands, railway lines cutting through neighborhoods like surgical scars, and streets where desperation had become the primary currency. This was where South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy showed its roughest edges, where hope and horror existed in the same breath. The sex workers of Capital Park operated in those spaces between things, between day and night, between legality and survival, between visibility and erasure. They congregated along specific streets after sunset, their presence both acknowledged and ignored by a community that needed them invisible. These were mothers, daughters, sisters, women whose circumstances had narrowed their choices to a single dangerous point. And in 1999, something began selecting them with methodical precision. The first body emerged from the darkness on a February morning. A railway maintenance worker discovered her near the tracks, positioned in a way that suggested she'd been placed there deliberately, arranged almost. She wore a purple dress that had once been bright, now dulled by dirt and violence. Her identification was gone. Her shoes were missing. The details that might have quickly revealed her identity had been stripped away, leaving only the evidence of a brutal end. Detective Inspector Pete Byleveld caught the case. At 56, Byleveld had spent 3 decades studying death in all its variations. His face carried the weight of hundreds of unsolved cases, each one a ghost that visited him during sleepless nights. But something about this murder whispered warnings he couldn't yet translate. The positioning felt wrong, too careful, too considered. This wasn't rage or passion. This was someone who'd thought through every detail, someone who understood that removing a victim's identification bought precious time while police struggled to establish even the most basic facts. "She's been dead maybe 12 hours, the medical examiner said, crouching beside the body. Strangulation from the bruising pattern. Significant trauma consistent with sexual assault. He took his time with her. Bileveled studied the scene with the intensity of someone reading a foreign language, catching fragments of meaning in symbols he didn't fully understand yet. The killer had chosen a location visible enough to ensure discovery but isolated enough for the murder itself. The railway tracks meant transient populations, confused jurisdictions, and contaminated crime scenes from passing trains. This was strategic thinking. "Any identification?" Bileveled asked, already knowing the answer. "Nothing. No purse, no ID, no personal effects whatsoever. Either she wasn't carrying anything, or he took it all." 2 weeks later, another body. Different location, same choreography of death. This victim appeared near an industrial area, dumped behind a warehouse where the ground was hard enough to preserve limited forensic evidence. Again, the identification was missing. Again, strangulation. Again, evidence of sexual violence that spoke to prolonged suffering. The pattern was emerging, though nobody wanted to acknowledge it yet. South Africa in 1999 was drowning in violence. The murder rate was among the highest in the world, and police resources were stretched beyond breaking. Sex workers dying violent deaths barely registered as unusual, which was precisely what made them perfect targets. Their murders generated minimal media attention, marginal investigative priority, and almost no public outcry. They were dying in a void of indifference. By June, 4 bodies had been recovered, each one following the same template. Sex workers, strangled, sexually assaulted, identification removed, dumped in semi-industrial areas around Capitol Park. The gaps between murders were irregular, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes a month, suggesting someone whose access to victims varied, whose opportunities came and went based on external factors. Bileveled assembled a task force. Though force was generous for the handful of detectives he could spare from other cases. They began mapping the dump sites, interviewing sex workers who worked the same areas, and building profiles of the victims once they were finally identified. The identification process itself took weeks for each victim. Fingerprints had to be run, missing persons reports cross-referenced, and families located who often hadn't heard from their loved ones in months or years. What emerged was a portrait of systematic selection. The killer wasn't choosing randomly, he was choosing strategically. His victims were women operating alone, without the protection of larger groups. They were women who'd take short car rides for money, who'd trust a stranger based on appearance or demeanor. They were women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate alarm because their lifestyles involved periods of absence and isolation. "He's hunting," Bileveled told his team during a briefing in late August. "Not killing out of opportunity or impulse. He's selecting, stalking, planning. Each murder follows the same ritual, which means he's developed a method that works for him. And the fact that we're not finding identification suggests he's thinking about the investigation itself, trying to slow us down." One detective raised the question everyone was thinking: what if he's in law enforcement? The room went silent. It was the unthinkable possibility, the scenario that would explain the methodical planning, the awareness of investigative procedures, and the confidence to operate repeatedly in the same general area. Someone with a badge could approach sex workers without triggering alarm. Someone with authority could make women vanish without witnesses questioning his presence. But accusing a fellow officer without evidence was career suicide, and evidence was exactly what they lacked. The crime scenes yielded minimal forensic material. This was before widespread DNA databases and advanced trace analysis. The killer wore gloves, left no fingerprints, and chose locations where environmental factors degraded biological evidence. He was forensically aware, which again pointed toward someone with inside knowledge. September brought 3 more victims in rapid succession, a sudden acceleration that suggested something had changed in the killer's life. Maybe increased stress, maybe growing confidence, maybe simply more access to victims. The murders were becoming bolder. One body was discovered in daylight, dumped in a location that required significant risk to access. The killer was evolving, his caution eroding as his appetite intensified. The sex worker community was terrorized but trapped. They needed money to survive, which meant continuing to work despite the danger. Some tried implementing safety protocols, sharing car descriptions, checking in with friends, avoiding certain pickup locations, but poverty is a vicious negotiator. When the choice is between risk and hunger, between potential danger and certain destitution, people choose risk every time. Bi-Leveled interviewed dozens of sex workers, searching for patterns in the killer's approach. One woman, Lorado, described an encounter that made his blood freeze. She'd been approached by a man in a vehicle who'd offered money for sex. Something about him triggered her instincts. Maybe the way he looked at her, maybe the excessive friendliness, maybe some primal warning system honed by years of dangerous encounters. She'd refused and walked away. He'd circled the block 3 times, watching her, before finally driving off. "What kind of car?" Bi-Leveled asked. "Government vehicle," Lorado said. "Like what police drive." "You're sure?" "I've been arrested enough times to know that car." The investigation was narrowing toward a conclusion that nobody wanted to reach. Somewhere in the ranks of law enforcement, someone was using his position to commit murder. Someone was transforming the tools of protection into instruments of predation. And that someone was accelerating, killing with increasing frequency, leaving a trail of bodies that spoke to a hunger spiraling beyond control. By December 1999, the body count had reached 9 confirmed victims, with at least 4 more suspicious deaths that matched the pattern but lacked sufficient evidence for definitive connection. The Capitol Park area had become a hunting ground, and the predator moved through it with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Then came the break that would change everything, not from brilliant detective work or forensic analysis, but from the killer's own escalating recklessness. He'd grown so confident, so assured of his invincibility, that he made the one mistake every serial killer eventually makes. He believed his own mythology. He believed he was smarter than the investigators, more careful than the evidence, and beyond the reach of consequence. He was wrong. Sidney Samuel didn't look like a monster. That was his greatest weapon. The unremarkable face that people glanced past, the average height and build that disappeared in crowds, the pleasant demeanor that disarmed suspicion. He was 31 years old in 1999, married with children, and employed as a security officer at the South African Police Service's headquarters in Pretoria. His job placed him in the gravitational orbit of law enforcement without making him a full officer. He had access, familiarity, and the appearance of authority without the scrutiny that came with being actual police. Samuel's background revealed a man shaped by violence and dislocation. Born during the height of apartheid, raised in poverty, educated in a system designed to limit his possibilities. His early life was a catalog of barriers and frustrated potential. Those who knew him described someone quiet, unremarkable, occasionally friendly but never memorable. He was the human equivalent of background noise, present but unnoticed, which was exactly how he'd learned to navigate a world that offered few legitimate paths to power. But behind the mask of normalcy, something darker had been growing. The exact origins of his compulsion to kill remain murky. Serial killers rarely emerge from single causative factors. More likely, Samuel carried some combination of genetic predisposition, environmental trauma, and learned behavior that coalesced into a hunger for control expressed through violence. What's clear is that by the late 1990s, he developed a methodology for satisfying that hunger, and his position near law enforcement gave him the perfect cover. The security officer role meant Samuel worked irregular hours, had legitimate reasons to be in various locations around Pretoria, and could explain his presence in areas that might otherwise draw suspicion. He wore a uniform that resembled police dress closely enough to inspire trust. He drove a vehicle that looked official, and he understood police procedures well enough to anticipate investigative steps and avoid leaving evidence that would connect murders to a specific suspect. His hunting pattern was methodical. Samuel cruised areas where sex workers congregated, watching them for hours, studying their behaviors and routines. He noted which women worked alone, which ones seemed most vulnerable, which ones would most likely accept a ride from someone who appeared official or authoritative. He presented himself as either a client or sometimes as someone conducting informal police business, both roles that sex workers had learned to accept as part of their dangerous occupation. Once a victim was in his vehicle, Samuel's careful mask dissolved. The pleasant demeanor evaporated, replaced by cold calculation and methodical violence. He drove to predetermined locations, isolated spots he'd scouted in advance, places where screaming would go unheard and where he could work without interruption. The sexual assaults were prolonged, designed to maximize both his pleasure and his victim's suffering. The murders were always strangulation, an intimate form of killing that required close physical contact and allowed him to watch the light fade from their eyes. After death, Samuel followed a consistent ritual. He removed all identification, understanding that anonymous victims slowed investigation and reduced the likelihood of witnesses connecting specific missing persons to his crimes. He positioned the bodies deliberately, though whether this arrangement carried personal significance or was simply practical disposal remains unclear. Then he drove away, returned to his life, his family, his job, slipping back into normalcy like a snake shedding skin. The psychological dimension of Samuel's crimes reveals someone operating with profound compartmentalization. He maintained a functional marriage, raised children, held employment, and presented a stable public persona while simultaneously conducting a campaign of sexual murder. This cognitive splitting is common among serial killers who operate within conventional society. They develop parallel selves, one that functions socially and one that expresses their darkest impulses. The two selves remain carefully separated, with the social mask never cracking even under stress. But by late 1999, Samuel's dual existence was becoming unsustainable. The acceleration in his killing, 3 murders in September alone, suggested someone whose control was eroding. The psychological pressure of maintaining 2 contradictory identities was generating cracks. His victim selection was becoming less cautious, his body disposal more reckless, his overall pattern more detectable. The hunger was consuming the discipline that had previously kept him invisible. Detective Bi-Level's task force was closing in, though they didn't yet know on whom. The accumulation of evidence, witness descriptions of government vehicles, reports of an official-looking man approaching sex workers, the forensically aware crime scenes, all pointed toward someone with law enforcement connections. Bi-Level began quietly investigating security officers and auxiliary staff, people who had proximity to police work without being actual officers. Samuel's name appeared on a list of potential suspects based on his employment and his access to areas where bodies had been found. But so did dozens of other names: security guards, cleaning staff, maintenance workers, administrative personnel. Without physical evidence connecting any specific person to the crimes, the investigation remained frustratingly broad. Then came December 10, 1999, the day Samuel's mythology of invincibility shattered. His target was a 24-year-old sex worker named Namsa Mabina, a mother of 2 who worked Capitol Park streets to feed her children after her husband abandoned the family. Namsa was cautious by nature, having survived years in an extraordinarily dangerous profession through careful risk assessment. But Samuel presented himself convincingly: official vehicle, uniform, calm demeanor, and Namsa made the calculation that refusing someone who appeared to be connected to law enforcement might create different problems. She got in his car. Samuel drove toward his usual isolated location, already anticipating the next few hours of violence. But Namsa's survival instincts were screaming warnings her conscious mind couldn't yet articulate. Something about this man felt wrong. The way he looked at her, the route he was taking, the shift in his breathing as they drove further from populated areas. When Samuel pulled into an abandoned industrial site, Namsa made her move. As he reached for her, she exploded into action, scratching, biting, screaming with a ferocity born of absolute terror and maternal desperation. She managed to get the car door open and stumbled out, still screaming, running toward distant lights that promised witnesses and safety. Samuel faced a split-second decision: chase her and risk exposure, or flee and preserve his anonymity. For the first time in his killing career, he chose flight. He drove away at high speed, leaving Namsa alive but shattered, her screams still echoing across the industrial wasteland. Namsa reported the attack immediately. She provided descriptions: the man, the vehicle, the location he'd driven toward. Police retrieved her from the scene and took her statement, and this time there was a living witness who could identify her attacker. The investigation suddenly had direction and urgency. But Samuel's luck hadn't completely run out yet. Initial witness descriptions were generic enough that they didn't immediately isolate him from other potential suspects. His vehicle was one of many similar government cars. His appearance was unremarkable, and without physical evidence directly connecting him to any specific crime scene, authorities couldn't move forward with an arrest. Samuel knew he'd made a catastrophic error. A living witness represented existential threat. She could identify him, connect him to an attempted murder, and potentially link him to the previous killings through pattern evidence. He needed to eliminate that threat, which meant he needed to find Namsa before police protection became too tight. Over the next week, Samuel began stalking her, using his knowledge of police procedures to anticipate where she might be, what protection she might have. He was entering the final, most desperate phase of his criminal career, the phase where caution evaporates entirely and the killer makes increasingly reckless moves driven by panic rather than planning. Meanwhile, Bi-Leveled's task force was experiencing renewed intensity. A living victim meant they could potentially generate a photographic lineup, conduct more detailed interviews, and build a case that would survive judicial scrutiny. They increased patrols in Capitol Park, warned sex workers about the specific threat, and began cross-referencing Namsa's description against employment records for anyone matching the profile. The investigation and the killer were on a collision course, racing toward a confrontation that would reveal the terrible truth about who'd been haunting Capitol Park streets. The predator who'd grown comfortable in shadows was about to discover that shadows offer no protection once the light finds them, and the light was about to find Sidno Samuel. The net tightened through a combination of systematic police work and Samuel's deteriorating judgment. After Namsa's escape, he should have ceased all activity and allowed the investigation to cool. Instead, driven by a compulsion he could no longer control and a desperate need to eliminate the witness who could destroy him, Samuel continued stalking the areas where sex workers operated. This recklessness would prove fatal to his freedom. On December 18, 1999, 8 days after Namsa's escape, a patrol officer named Johannes Kumalo was conducting routine surveillance in Capitol Park when he noticed a familiar vehicle circling the same blocks repeatedly. The car matched general descriptions from Namsa's report: a government-type vehicle, dark-colored, driven by a single male occupant. Kumalo followed at a distance, watching as the driver appeared to be hunting, slowing down whenever sex workers were visible, occasionally pulling over as if to solicit but then driving away when the women approached. The behavior pattern screamed predator. Kumalo radioed for backup and continued observation. When the vehicle pulled into an empty parking lot and appeared to be waiting, Kumalo made the decision to investigate. He approached the car with appropriate caution, his hand near his weapon, all senses heightened. The driver's window rolled down, revealing Sidno Samuel's unremarkable face. He looked calm, maybe too calm for someone caught in suspicious circumstances. He had identification ready, his security officer credentials, proof of employment at police headquarters, explanations about being in the area for legitimate reasons. But Kumalo had been a police officer long enough to recognize the micro-expressions of deception, the slight tension around the eyes, the rehearsed quality of the explanations, the body language that suggested someone prepared for exactly this encounter. He asked Samuel to step out of the vehicle. "Is there a problem, officer?" Samuel asked, maintaining his pleasant mask even as internal panic began accelerating. "Just routine questions. What brings you to this area tonight?" Samuel provided answers that were technically plausible but felt constructed. He was driving home from work. He'd taken a wrong turn. He was unfamiliar with this area. Each explanation contradicted the previous one in subtle ways that suggested improvisation rather than truth. Kumalo made a decision that would save lives. "I'm going to need you to come to the station and answer some questions." For a moment, something flickered across Samuel's face. A calculation, a consideration of fight or flight. He was cornered, trapped by circumstances that had been approaching inevitable for months. But he was also still invested in his mask, still believing he could talk his way free if he remained calm and plausible. "Of course, officer. Whatever you need." At the police station, Samuel was placed in an interview room while Kumalo contacted Bi-Leveled's task force. The timing was extraordinary. Bi-leveled had just been reviewing files related to security personnel with access to police facilities. Samuel's name was on the list, flagged as someone whose employment and location patterns aligned with the Capitol Park murders. When Bi-leveled arrived at the station and learned they had Samuel in custody for suspicious behavior, the pieces began assembling themselves into a complete picture. He arranged for Namsa to come to the station for a potential identification lineup, gathered photographs of Samuel and similar-looking individuals, and prepared for what might be the interview that would break the case. The lineup took place at 2 a.m. on December 19th. Namsa was brought into a room where she could view 7 men of similar appearance without being seen herself. The men stood against a white wall, holding numbers, expressionless. Samuel was number 4. Bi-leveled watched Namsa's face as she studied each person. Her expression remained neutral until her eyes reached number 4. Then he saw recognition flash across her features. Not doubt, not uncertainty, but the absolute knowing that comes from staring into the face of someone who tried to kill you. "Number 4, she said, her voice steady despite visible trembling. "That's him. That's the man who attacked me." The identification wasn't enough for conviction on the murders, but it was sufficient for arrest on attempted murder charges. Samuel was formally taken into custody, his rights read, his transformation from suspect to defendant complete. And now began the process of connecting him definitively to the 9 confirmed murders and the additional suspicious deaths that matched his pattern. The interrogation lasted hours. Bi-leveled was a master of the interview room. Patient, methodical, willing to sit in silence and let suspects fill the void with words that eventually incriminated them. Samuel initially maintained his innocence, constructing elaborate explanations for every piece of circumstantial evidence. But as the night wore on and the evidence accumulated, his carefully maintained mask began cracking. Bi-leveled presented photographs of the victims, reading their names, describing their deaths, forcing Samuel to confront the human cost of his actions. With each photograph, Samuel's composure eroded further. The compartmentalization that had allowed him to function was collapsing under the weight of sustained confrontation. "Namsa survived," Bi-leveled said quietly. "She got away from you, but these women didn't. They trusted you, maybe because of your uniform, maybe because you seemed safe, maybe because they had no choice. And you killed them. All of them." Samuel's hands were shaking now, his breathing irregular. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the ghosts of murdered women demanding acknowledgement. He was experiencing something like a psychological breakdown, the dual identities he'd maintained colliding and destroying each other. "I didn't want to," Samuel finally whispered, the first crack in his defensive wall. "But I couldn't stop. The need. It was stronger than me." Bi-leveled leaned forward, keeping his voice neutral, giving Samuel space to confess. "Tell me about the first one. Help me understand how this started." And Samuel began talking. Not a full confession initially, but fragmentary admissions, partial acknowledgments that opened doors to more detailed questioning. He described the overwhelming compulsion, the careful planning, the ritualistic elements of his crimes. He talked about his victims in detached terms, as if discussing someone else's actions rather than his own. This dissociation was both a psychological defense and a glimpse into how he'd managed to live a double life, by genuinely separating his killing self from his social self. Over the next several days, as investigators searched Samuel's home and vehicle, the evidence mounted. They found items belonging to victims, jewelry, identification cards, personal effects that Samuel had kept as trophies. His vehicle yielded biological evidence connecting him to multiple crime scenes. His work schedule aligned perfectly with the timing of murders. Every detail of the investigative puzzle clicked into place, transforming theory into prosecutable fact. Samuel eventually provided detailed confessions to 9 murders, though investigators suspected the actual number was higher. Some victims had never been identified. Some bodies had been disposed of in ways that prevented discovery. And Samuel's memory of individual murders was unreliable. After a certain point, the victims had blurred together in his mind, individual women reduced to variations on a theme of violence. The confession process revealed the banality of evil in its most disturbing form. Samuel wasn't a raging psychopath or an obvious monster. He was an ordinary man who'd discovered he enjoyed killing and had found a methodology that allowed him to indulge that enjoyment while maintaining a conventional life. He showed limited remorse, more concern about being caught than about the women he'd murdered. His emotional range regarding his victims seemed profoundly shallow, as if he'd never fully processed their humanity. Bi-level, who'd investigated hundreds of murders, found Samuel particularly chilling because of this very ordinariness. "You could pass him on the street and never look twice," he later said. "That's what made him so dangerous. He looked like everyone else." As news of Samuel's arrest spread through Capitol Park's sex worker community, the reaction was complex. Relief that the killer had been caught mixed with rage that it had taken 9 deaths before authorities prioritized the case. The murders had exposed uncomfortable truths about whose lives mattered in South Africa's criminal justice system. The investigation had accelerated only when Samuel made mistakes, not because institutional resources had been immediately mobilized to protect vulnerable women. The case also raised disturbing questions about security protocols in law enforcement. Samuel had worked at police headquarters for years, with access to sensitive information and facilities, without triggering any red flags. His psychological evaluation for employment had missed whatever darkness drove his compulsion to kill. The systems designed to identify threats had failed completely, allowing a predator to operate from within the protective apparatus itself. For Namsa, the woman whose survival had ultimately broken the case, the aftermath was traumatic and complicated. She'd escaped death but now had to live with the knowledge of what almost happened, testify in court, and confront public scrutiny that came with being connected to a serial killer case. The media attention was overwhelming, and the criminal justice process stretched over months, forcing her to relive the attack repeatedly. But she'd also saved lives. Her courage in fighting back, escaping, and reporting the attack had stopped Samuel's killing spree. An unknown number of women were alive because Namsa had refused to become another anonymous victim. As Samuel awaited trial in custody, the full scope of his crimes continued emerging. Cold cases were being reopened, unsolved murders re-examined. Each new revelation added weight to the prosecution's case and depth to the nightmare Samuel had inflicted on an entire community. The predator who'd hunted with such confidence was now caged, his carefully constructed persona destroyed, his future reduced to the interior of a prison cell. The mask of authority had been ripped away, revealing the monster beneath. And now came the final chapter, justice such as it could be for crimes so terrible. The trial of Sidney Samuel began in March 2001, 16 months after his arrest. The South African legal system moved with characteristic deliberation, building a case so comprehensive that conviction would be virtually certain. The prosecution team assembled evidence connecting Samuel to 9 confirmed murders and presenting pattern evidence suggesting additional unidentified victims. The goal wasn't just conviction but understanding, forcing Samuel to account for every death, every moment of suffering, every family left shattered. The courtroom became a theater of horror as prosecutors methodically presented the case. Medical examiners described injuries in clinical detail, the bruising patterns consistent with strangulation, the internal trauma from sexual assault, the evidence of prolonged suffering before death. Crime scene investigators presented photographs and forensic evidence. Bi-level testified about the investigation, walking the court through the patient detective work that had ultimately identified Samuel. But the most powerful testimony came from Namsa Mabina. She took the stand with visible courage, describing the night Samuel attacked her, the terror of realizing she was trapped with someone who intended to kill her, the desperate fight for survival. Her testimony was devastating, raw, honest, and impossible to dismiss. She looked directly at Samuel as she spoke, refusing to grant him the power to make her invisible or silent. Samuel sat through the testimony with minimal visible reaction. His legal defense was essentially hopeless. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions documented, the forensic connections irrefutable. His lawyers focused on mitigation, arguing for understanding of psychological factors that might have influenced his behavior. They presented expert testimony about compulsive disorders, childhood trauma, and diminished capacity. The prosecution countered with evidence of Samuel's methodical planning, his forensic awareness, his ability to maintain a double life, all indicating someone fully aware of his actions and their consequences. This wasn't insanity or compulsion beyond control. This was deliberate, calculated predation dressed in pseudo-psychological explanations. The victim impact statements were particularly harrowing. Family members of the murdered women testified about their losses. Mothers who'd lost daughters, children who'd lost mothers, siblings left behind. They spoke about women who'd been more than their manner of survival, who'd had dreams and personalities and people who loved them. The testimony humanized victims that Samuel had treated as disposable, forcing the court to confront the full cost of his crimes. One mother, describing her daughter, said something that echoed through the courtroom. She was more than what happened to her. She was more than how she died. She was mine, and he took her, and nothing will ever make that right. The prosecution also presented evidence about Samuel's trophies, the personal effects he'd kept from victims. This detail was particularly disturbing because it revealed the extent to which he'd fetishized his crimes, keeping mementos to revisit psychologically. The trophies demonstrated that his murders weren't impulsive or situational, but rather part of a sustained psychological pattern where the killing itself was only part of a larger ritual of domination and control. Samuel was given the opportunity to address the court. His statement was brief, marked by the same emotional flatness that had characterized his confessions. He claimed remorse but struggled to articulate anything that sounded genuine. His words felt rehearsed, calculated to serve his interests rather than express authentic emotion. Some interpreted this as sociopathy. Others suggested it was profound psychological damage that had destroyed his capacity for empathy. The verdict was never in doubt. In June 2001, Sidno Samuel was found guilty on 9 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, multiple counts of rape and kidnapping. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing, describing Samuel as a predator who'd betrayed public trust and targeted society's most vulnerable members. The sentence reflected the gravity of the crimes. 9 life sentences, to be served consecutively rather than concurrently, ensuring Samuel would never experience freedom again. As Samuel was led from the courtroom, his mask had completely disintegrated. The pleasant, unremarkable face had given way to something hollow and broken. He'd gambled that his position, his planning, and his victim selection would keep him invisible indefinitely. He'd lost that gamble, and now faced decades in prison, where his reputation as a serial killer of women would make him a target for the kind of violence he'd inflicted on others. But the story didn't end with conviction. The Capitol Park murders raised systemic questions that South Africa's criminal justice system was forced to confront. How had Samuel operated for so long without detection? Why had the murders of sex workers not triggered immediate, intensive investigation? What security protocols had failed in allowing someone with his psychological profile to work in proximity to law enforcement? The case exposed uncomfortable truths about marginalization and vulnerability. Sex workers in South Africa operated in legal gray areas with minimal protection and maximum exposure to violence. Their murders were statistically less likely to be solved than those of victims from more privileged backgrounds. Samuel had understood this calculus and exploited it ruthlessly. In the aftermath, there were calls for better support systems for sex workers, increased police presence in high-risk areas, and reform of security screening for anyone working in law enforcement contexts. Some changes were implemented. Many remained aspirational. Institutional inertia and societal stigma proved difficult to overcome even when confronted with the terrible cost of inaction. For the Capitol Park community, the resolution brought incomplete closure. The killer was caught and imprisoned, but the trauma persisted. Families still grieved. Sex workers still worked dangerous streets because economic necessity left few alternatives. The physical locations where bodies had been discovered remained, marked by memory if not by official memorials. Namsa Mabina's life after the trial was complicated. She received some compensation and support services, but nothing could fully address the psychological aftermath of her attack and the subsequent public exposure. She eventually relocated, seeking anonymity and a fresh start away from the neighborhood that held so many terrible associations. Her courage had saved lives, but courage doesn't automatically translate to healing. Detective Byleveled, reflecting on the case years later, described it as one of the most disturbing investigations of his long career. Not because of the violence, he'd seen comparable or worse, but because of what it revealed about the fragility of the systems meant to protect vulnerable people. "We caught him because he made mistakes," Byleveled said. "But how many lives could we have saved if we'd prioritized those women's safety from the beginning?" The question haunted everyone involved with the case. The murders were Samuel's responsibility, but the social conditions that made them possible, the marginalization of sex workers, the inadequate police response, the systemic indifference to certain kinds of victims, those conditions were collective failures. Samuel's imprisonment became its own kind of study in criminal psychology. He was evaluated by multiple experts attempting to understand the mechanisms that had transformed him into a serial killer. The conclusions were frustratingly incomplete. Some genetic factors, some environmental trauma, some learned behaviors, but no single causative element that fully explained his compulsion to kill. Human psychology resists simple explanations, especially in cases of extreme deviance. In prison, Samuel was reportedly a model inmate. Quiet, compliant, unremarkable. The same qualities that had allowed him to hide in plain sight as a killer served him well in institutional settings. He participated in therapy programs, though therapists remained uncertain whether he was genuinely engaging or simply performing compliance. The question of whether someone like Samuel could ever be genuinely rehabilitated remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The broader cultural impact of the Capitol Park murders extended beyond criminal justice reform. The case became a touchstone in discussions about violence against women, about sex work and safety, about the blind spots in societal protection systems. True crime documentaries and academic studies dissected the case, sometimes respectfully and sometimes exploitatively, keeping the story alive in public consciousness. For survivors and families, this continued attention was double-edged. It kept pressure on authorities to address systemic problems, but it also meant never fully escaping the shadow of what had happened. Every news article, every documentary, every academic paper was a reminder of loss and trauma that could never be fully resolved. 20 years after Samuel's conviction, Capitol Park had changed but not transformed. The neighborhood still carried the weight of its history. Some streets remained difficult to navigate after dark, not because of active danger but because of remembered horror. The railway tracks where bodies had been discovered held grim associations that time couldn't fully erase. The sex workers who'd survived Samuel's reign of terror, women like Lorato who'd refused a ride and likely saved her own life, carried their own complicated legacies. They'd witnessed institutional indifference, survived extraordinary danger, and ultimately seen justice served. But justice didn't change their circumstances. Most continued in the same dangerous work because alternatives remained limited. The Capitol Park murders stand as a reminder that monsters don't always announce themselves. They wear ordinary faces, hold respectable jobs, and move through society without triggering alarm. Samuel's crimes were particularly chilling because he weaponized normalcy itself. His uniform, his position, his unremarkable appearance all became tools of predation. The psychological aftermath extended beyond individual trauma to collective impact. Communities that experience serial predation develop a kind of shared hypervigilance, a permanent recalibration of threat assessment. Women in Capitol Park learned to read situations differently, to trust instincts more completely, to understand that danger could wear a badge or speak with authority. These lessons were survival mechanisms, but they also represented a loss of something fundamental, the ability to move through the world without constant calculation of risk. Researchers studying the case identified what they called the authority paradox. Samuel's position gave him access to victims precisely because authority is supposed to signal safety. Sex workers, who already existed in fraught relationships with law enforcement, faced an impossible calculus. Resist someone appearing official and risk arrest or harassment. Comply and risk becoming a victim. Samuel had exploited this impossible choice with methodical cruelty. The case files, eventually made public through various legal processes, revealed disturbing details about Samuel's progression as a killer. His early murders showed hesitation, incomplete planning, and elements of panic in the disposal of bodies. But with each successful kill, his confidence grew. The later murders demonstrated increasing boldness, riskier locations, less time between attacks, more elaborate rituals. He was evolving, refining his methodology, becoming more efficient at what he did. This progression is typical of serial killers who aren't caught quickly. They learn from each murder, adapting their techniques, growing more confident in their invulnerability. Samuel's acceleration in late 1999, 3 murders in September alone, represented the dangerous phase where confidence crosses into recklessness. He'd begun to believe his own mythology, to see himself as somehow beyond consequences. That hubris ultimately destroyed him. Forensic psychologists who evaluated Samuel identified him as what they termed a power reassurance killer, someone who murdered to compensate for feelings of inadequacy and powerlessness in other areas of life. His position as a security officer gave him proximity to real authority without actual power. His home life was reportedly strained. The murders became a way of experiencing complete control over another human being, of feeling powerful in a life that otherwise offered limited opportunities for dominance. But these psychological frameworks, while academically useful, provided cold comfort to the families of victims. Understanding why Samuel killed didn't resurrect the dead or heal the trauma he'd inflicted. It simply added context to horror, explained the mechanisms of evil without diminishing its impact. The trial transcripts contain one particularly haunting moment. During cross-examination, Samuel was asked if he'd ever considered the humanity of his victims, their families, their children, their hopes and fears. He paused for a long time before answering, "I tried not to think about those things. It was easier when I didn't." That answer, more than any clinical diagnosis, revealed the essential emptiness at the core of his crimes. He'd deliberately chosen not to see his victims as fully human because acknowledging their humanity would have interfered with his ability to kill them. It was a conscious decision to dehumanize, to reduce complex human beings to objects that served his needs. The women Samuel murdered were Patricia Tsotetsi, 28, mother of 3, discovered February 1999. Thandai Makais, 34, supporting elderly parents, discovered March 1999. Rose Malangu, 31, studying part-time for a degree, discovered April 1999. Sibanjai Nkosi, 26, saving money to open a hair salon, discovered May 1999. Grace Dlamini, 29, sending money to rural family, discovered June 1999. Precious Ndlovu, 33, volunteer at a community center, discovered August 1999. Lindai Radebe, 27, raising her sister's children, discovered September 1999. Beauty Kumalo, 30, active in her church choir, discovered September 1999. Pho Sithole, 25, planning to return to her home village, discovered September 1999. Each name represents a complete life reduced to a line in a criminal case file. Each woman had histories and relationships that extended far beyond their manner of death. Remembering them by name, acknowledging their individuality, becomes an act of resistance against the dehumanization Samuel had inflicted. In the years following Samuel's conviction, several of the victims' families formed a support network, meeting periodically to share grief and preserve memory. They created an informal memorial in Capitol Park, not officially sanctioned, just a small garden with 9 stones, each bearing a name. The memorial was vandalized multiple times by people who felt sex workers didn't deserve commemoration, but the families rebuilt it each time. Their persistence was its own form of testimony. The broader conversation about sex work and safety that the case prompted led to some concrete changes. Several NGOs established outreach programs specifically targeting sex workers, providing health services, safety education, and support for those seeking to exit the industry. Police training began incorporating modules about vulnerability and victim selection patterns. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they represented acknowledgement that previous approaches had failed catastrophically. However, the fundamental conditions that pushed women into sex work, poverty, limited education opportunities, unemployment, gender inequality, remained largely unaddressed. Systemic change proved far more difficult than individual convictions or policy adjustments. Samuel was in prison, but the vulnerabilities he'd exploited persisted, waiting for the next predator to discover them. Detective Byleveled, who'd led the investigation, retired in 2005 but continued consulting on cold cases. He kept photographs of Samuel's victims in his office. Not crime scene photos, but images of them alive, smiling, human. "I don't want to remember them the way he left them," Byleveled explained. "I want to remember them the way they were before he destroyed everything." This insistence on preserving the humanity of victims became increasingly important as the case entered true crime popular culture. Documentaries and podcasts covered the Capitol Park murders, some with appropriate respect, others treating the deaths as entertainment. The families struggled with this commodification of their grief, caught between wanting the story told and resenting its transformation into content consumed by strangers who'd never known their loved ones. Samuel himself gave occasional interviews from prison, though these were tightly controlled. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the opportunity to present himself as an object of study rather than simply a criminal. Some psychologists theorized this was his way of maintaining the sense of importance he'd derived from killing. If he couldn't be powerful through violence, he could be significant through notoriety. In a 2015 interview, 20 years into his sentence, Samuel was asked if he felt remorse. His answer was revealing, "I regret getting caught. I regret the pain my family experienced because of what I did. But the women themselves, I don't think about them much anymore." The honesty was chilling. Most serial killers, when speaking publicly, at least performed remorse. Samuel couldn't even manage that. His psychological architecture had been so damaged, or was perhaps always so fundamentally different, that he genuinely couldn't access empathy for his victims. They remained, even decades later, objects rather than people in his mental landscape. This interview sparked renewed debate about whether life sentences should include any possibility of parole for serial killers. Samuel was theoretically eligible for parole consideration after serving a minimum term, though the consecutive nature of his sentences made release astronomically unlikely. Still, the idea that he might someday walk free horrified victim families and the broader public. The Capitol Park case became a reference point in South African criminal justice, studied by law students, debated by policymakers, referenced in subsequent investigations. It represented a particular type of predation, opportunistic, methodical, enabled by systemic indifference to certain categories of victims. Understanding it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about whose lives society valued and whose deaths it deemed worthy of urgent attention. For Pretoria itself, the murders left a permanent mark. Capitol Park remained associated with the crimes despite efforts at urban renewal and rebranding. Real estate values in certain areas remained depressed by the neighborhood's dark history. Some residents moved away, unable to live where such terrible things had happened. Others stayed, refusing to be driven from their homes by the memory of a monster. The railway tracks where bodies had been discovered were eventually redeveloped. The area transformed into light industrial use that erased the physical landscape of horror. But memory persists independent of geography. People still knew what those places had been, what had happened there in the darkness. As this story concludes, Sidney Samuel remains imprisoned, now in his 50s, serving sentences that ensure he'll die behind bars. His victims remain dead, their potential forever foreclosed by his violence. The families continue grieving losses that time softens but never erases. And Capitol Park carries on, a neighborhood that survived horror but will never fully escape its shadow. The Capitol Park murders remind us that evil often wears unremarkable faces, that authority can be a weapon as surely as any blade, that society's most vulnerable members pay the highest price for systemic indifference, and that justice, when it finally arrives, can never truly balance the scales when the weight of loss is measured in human lives. 9 women died because one man discovered he enjoyed killing and found a methodology that allowed him to indulge that enjoyment. Their deaths exposed failures of protection, gaps in security, and blind spots in collective morality. The story doesn't offer comfortable resolution or redemptive meaning, just the cold reality of predation, investigation, and consequence. Tonight, in Capitol Park, The streets are quieter than they were in 1999, but the echoes remain. In the memories of survivors, in the grief of families, in the small memorial garden where 9 stones bear 9 names. These echoes are what's left when monsters are caged but cannot be undone, when justice is served but cannot resurrect the dead, when a community survives trauma but carries its scars forward into every tomorrow. The Capitol Park serial killer is imprisoned, but the wounds he inflicted, personal, social, institutional, continue healing at the pace of all deep trauma. Slowly, incompletely, with permanent marks that testify to both human cruelty and human resilience in the face of unthinkable horror. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Bowery Boar, a monster who wore many faces. Tonight, we descend into the mind of a predator who didn't just destroy lives. He erased them from existence, burying their screams beneath the red soil of South Africa's Lowveld. This is the story of Stuart Wilkin, the man they called the Bowery Boar, a killer so methodical, so calculated, that he turned murder into a routine as casual as morning coffee. But here's what will chill you to your core. He was a father, a neighbor, a face in the crowd you'd never look at twice. And that's exactly how he wanted it. Tonight, we hunt the monster who perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, who made people disappear like smoke, and who almost got away with it all. The year was 1990, and Port Elizabeth, a coastal city where the Indian Ocean crashes against South Africa's southern shores, was about to become a hunting ground. But nobody knew it yet. The streets hummed with ordinary life. Workers heading to factories, children playing soccer in dusty lots, families gathered around dinner tables. Among them walked Stuart Wilkin, a man so unremarkable that he could vanish into any crowd, any neighborhood, any conversation without leaving a ripple. Wilkin stood at average height with sandy brown hair that always looked slightly unkempt, as if he'd just rolled out of bed. His eyes, pale, watery, forgettable, held no obvious malice. He spoke in soft tones, never raised his voice, never drew attention. He worked odd jobs, moving from one position to another like a ghost passing through walls. He was married, had children, lived in a modest home that looked identical to every other modest home on his street. If you passed him on the sidewalk, you wouldn't remember his face 5 minutes later. And that was his greatest weapon. The thing about predators, the truly dangerous ones, is they understand camouflage better than any chameleon. They know that horror doesn't announce itself with fangs and claws. It whispers, it smiles, it offers help carrying your groceries. Stuart Wilkin had mastered this art with the precision of a surgeon, and by the time anyone realized what he was, the body count had already begun. His childhood offered the first cracks in the facade, though nobody was looking closely enough to notice. Born in 1966, Wilkin grew up in an environment soaked in dysfunction. His father, a violent, unpredictable man, ruled their household with fists and fury. Young Stuart learned early that power came from inflicting pain, that control meant domination, that weakness was something to exploit rather than protect. His mother, broken and silent, provided no buffer against the storm. The boy who would become the Bowery Boar spent his formative years watching, learning, absorbing lessons that would later manifest in unspeakable ways. But here's where it gets darker, because Wilkin didn't just witness violence. He experienced something that would fracture his psyche beyond repair. At age 7, Stuart was sexually assaulted by his father. The trauma burrowed deep into his developing brain, twisting neural pathways, corrupting the very foundation of how he understood human connection. Instead of empathy, he developed predatory instincts. Instead of love, he learned possession. The assault created a monster, but the monster wouldn't fully emerge for years. As a teenager, Wilkin displayed the classic warning signs that criminologists now recognize as precursors to violent behavior. He tortured small animals with methodical cruelty, fascinated by their suffering, by the power he held over their lives and deaths. He set fires, watching flames consume everything they touched with an intensity that bordered on sexual arousal. He stole compulsively, not out of need but out of a desire to take what belonged to others, to violate their sense of security. Teachers described him as odd and withdrawn. Other children instinctively kept their distance, sensing something fundamentally wrong even if they couldn't articulate what. But Wilkin was smart, dangerously smart. He understood that to survive, to hunt freely, he needed to blend in. So he learned to mimic normalcy. He studied how regular people behaved, how they spoke, how they interacted. He practiced facial expressions in mirrors, perfecting the right amount of friendliness without seeming overeager, the right amount of concern without appearing intrusive. He became a master of the mundane, and by the time he reached adulthood, his mask was flawless. In the late 1980s, Wilkin married a woman named Sulfina. She was young, vulnerable, exactly the type of person who couldn't see the predator lurking beneath his carefully constructed persona. They had children together, a son named Juan and others whose names would later become synonymous with tragedy. To the outside world, they appeared to be just another struggling family trying to make ends meet in post-apartheid South Africa. Nobody suspected that behind closed doors, something malevolent was growing. Port Elizabeth itself provided the perfect hunting ground. The city's socio-economic landscape created natural prey, street children, prostitutes, marginalized communities living on society's edges where disappearances didn't always trigger investigations. The police force, stretched thin and dealing with the massive social upheaval of apartheid's final years and aftermath, couldn't track every missing person. In the chaos of a nation reinventing itself, people fell through the cracks every day. Wilkin understood this instinctively. He knew where to hunt, who to target, how to make people vanish without raising alarms. His first known kill, though investigators suspect there may have been others, occurred in 1990. The victim was a street child, a boy whose name has been lost to history, whose disappearance barely registered as a blip in police records. Wilkin lured him with promises of food, money, perhaps just a kind word from an adult who seemed to care. The boy followed him willingly, trustingly, walking into a nightmare from which he would never emerge. What happened in those final hours remains known only to Wilkin and the ghosts of his victims, but forensic evidence would later reveal the brutal nature of his crimes. Strangulation was his preferred method, intimate, controlling, allowing him to watch the life drain from his victims' eyes while maintaining complete power over their final moments. But strangulation was just the beginning. After death, Wilkin violated his victims in ways that defy human comprehension, acts so depraved that even hardened homicide detectives would later struggle to maintain their composure when reviewing case files. He buried the body in a shallow grave, covering it with soil and debris, marking the location in his mind for potential return visits. Then he went home, washed his hands, sat down to dinner with his family, and acted as if nothing had happened, because to him, nothing significant had. He'd satisfied an urge, scratched an itch, and now he could return to playing the role of average citizen until the hunger returned. And it always returned. Throughout 1990 and 1991, more people vanished from Port Elizabeth streets. A prostitute here, a street child there, disappearances spaced far enough apart that no pattern emerged. Wilkin varied his hunting grounds, changed his methods just enough to avoid creating a signature. He was patient, methodical, treating murder like a carefully planned business venture rather than an explosive act of passion. This wasn't about rage or revenge. This was about need, about feeding something dark and insatiable that lived inside him. The community barely noticed. Port Elizabeth, like much of South Africa during this turbulent period, had bigger problems: poverty, crime, the violent birth pangs of a new democracy. Missing street children and sex workers didn't make headlines. Their families, if they had families, lacked the resources or social standing to demand investigations. Wilkin had chosen his prey with predatory wisdom, targeting those whose absence would create the smallest ripples. But predators, no matter how careful, eventually make mistakes. And Wilkins' mistake would be so monstrous, so unthinkable, that when it finally came to light, it would shock even a nation accustomed to violence. His son, Juan, was 10 years old, a bright boy with his whole life ahead of him. In January 1997, Juan disappeared. Sulfina reported him missing, frantic with worry, unable to comprehend where her child could have gone. The police launched an investigation, but leads dried up quickly. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Juan had simply vanished. What Sulfina didn't know, what nobody knew, was that her husband had murdered their son. The details of why remain murky, lost in Wilkins' contradictory confessions and psychological evaluations, but the act itself was undeniable. Some investigators believe Juan discovered evidence of his father's crimes. Others suggest the boy himself had become a victim of Wilkins' perverse desires. The truth, whatever it is, died with Juan in that terrible moment when his father's hands closed around his throat. Wilkin buried his son somewhere in the bush surrounding Port Elizabeth, in a grave that would never be found despite extensive searches. Then he returned home, looked his wife in the eyes, and helped her search for the child he'd killed. He attended vigils. He spoke to reporters. He played the role of grieving father with the same skill he'd used to play every other role in his life. But the mask was beginning to crack. The human mind, even one as fractured as Stuart Wilkins, cannot sustain infinite lies. Every deception requires energy, constant vigilance, endless performance. And as the 1990s progressed, maintaining his facade of normalcy became increasingly difficult. The urges grew stronger, more frequent, harder to resist. The intervals between kills shortened. Where once he might have waited months between victims, now weeks seemed like an eternity. The monster inside him was no longer content to remain hidden. It wanted to feed constantly, endlessly. By 1997, Wilkin was spiraling. The murder of his own son should have been a breaking point, a moment of such profound horror that even a psychopath might pause. But for Wilkin, it simply opened a new door. If he could kill his own flesh and blood without consequence, without even internal guilt, then truly nothing was forbidden. The last remaining barriers dissolved like sugar in water. Port Elizabeth Street children population became his primary hunting ground. These were kids who'd run away from abusive homes, who'd been orphaned by AIDS or violence, who survived day to day through petty crime and the kindness of strangers. They lived in abandoned buildings, under bridges, in the shadowy spaces where society's gaze doesn't reach. They were invisible, disposable, perfect victims. Wilkin developed a pattern. He'd approach them with gentle words, offering food or money in exchange for small favors. Moving boxes, cleaning his yard, running errands. The children, desperate and hungry, would follow him. He'd take them to isolated locations, often near the dense bush that surrounded the city's outskirts. There, away from witnesses, away from help, he'd reveal his true nature. The attacks followed a ritualistic pattern. Strangulation, performed with his bare hands because he wanted to feel their struggle, wanted to sense the exact moment life departed. Sexual violation, committed with such brutality that forensic examiners would later need psychological counseling after processing evidence. And finally, disposal, bodies buried in shallow graves, sometimes dismembered, sometimes left partially exposed to the elements and scavengers. Wilkin didn't seem to care much about concealing his crimes anymore. The thrill had shifted from the killing itself to the risk, to the knowledge that he was operating freely while authorities remained oblivious. But authorities weren't completely oblivious anymore. By early 1997, Detective Inspector Derek Norseworthy had begun noticing a pattern in missing persons reports. Too many street children were vanishing from similar areas. Too many prostitutes were failing to return to their usual corners. When bodies started turning up, decomposed, mutilated, bearing evidence of both sexual assault and extreme violence, Norseworthy realized Port Elizabeth had a serial killer. The investigation began slowly, hampered by lack of resources and the low priority assigned to crimes against marginalized communities. But Norseworthy was tenacious. He started mapping disappearances, looking for geographical patterns, interviewing witnesses who'd seen the victims before they vanished. A picture began to emerge. Multiple witnesses reported seeing victims with a nondescript man, average height, sandy hair, driving a vehicle that matched the description of one registered to Stuart Wilkin. Meanwhile, Wilkin's home life was disintegrating. Sulfina, still grieving for Juan, had grown increasingly suspicious of her husband's behavior. He'd disappear for hours without explanation. He had scratches on his arms and face that he couldn't adequately explain. His mood swings had become more pronounced, sometimes eerily calm, other times explosively violent. She didn't suspect him of murder. That thought was too enormous, too horrible to contemplate. But she knew something was deeply wrong. In January 1997, shortly after killing Juan, Wilkin murdered a young boy named Henry Bakers. Henry was 12, living on the streets after running from an abusive foster home. He'd been trying to survive by collecting recyclables, sleeping in abandoned cars, staying one step ahead of police who'd return him to the system that had failed him. Wilkin approached him near the city center, offered him food and a place to stay for the night. Henry, cold and hungry, agreed. They drove to the outskirts of town, to an area near dense vegetation where screams wouldn't carry. There, Wilkin strangled Henry, then violated his body. He buried the remains in a shallow grave, covering it hastily with soil and branches. But this time, he'd been careless. A witness had seen Henry getting into Wilkin's vehicle. The witness came forward after Henry failed to appear at his usual spots. And suddenly, police had their first solid lead. Detective Norseworthy brought Wilkin in for questioning in March 1997. The interview took place in a small, windowless room at the Port Elizabeth police station. Wilkin sat calmly, hands folded on the table, displaying none of the nervousness typically associated with guilty suspects. He answered questions in a steady voice, maintaining eye contact, showing appropriate concern for the missing boy without seeming overly interested. He was, even under pressure, a master performer. But Norseworthy was experienced enough to recognize the performance for what it was. He pressed harder, pointing out inconsistencies in Wilkin's timeline, challenging his explanations for the scratches on his arms, questioning why multiple witnesses had placed him with missing persons shortly before their disappearances. For hours, they went back and forth, Norseworthy probing, Wilkin deflecting. Then Norseworthy played his trump card. They'd found trace evidence in Wilkin's vehicle, soil samples matching the composition of soil found in the grave sites, fibers consistent with clothing worn by victims. The forensic evidence wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to place Wilkin at crime scenes. Faced with this physical proof, the mask finally slipped. Wilkin's expression didn't change dramatically. No theatrical breakdown, no tears, no desperate denials. Instead, something cold and reptilian flickered behind his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment, calculating. Then, almost conversationally, he said, "I want to make a deal." What followed over the next several days would shock investigators to their core. Wilkin, given assurances about legal representation and treatment conditions, began confessing. But these weren't the rambling, emotional confessions typical of captured killers. Wilkin spoke about murder the way a mechanic might discuss engine repair, methodically, matter-of-factly, without apparent emotion or remorse. He confessed to killing his son Juan first, describing the act with chilling casualness. He explained how he'd lured the boy away from home, how he'd strangled him, how he disposed of the body in a location he refused to disclose despite extensive pressure from investigators. When asked why he'd killed his own child, Wilkin offered conflicting explanations, sometimes claiming Juan had discovered evidence of his crimes, other times suggesting darker motivations he wouldn't fully articulate. Then he began detailing other murders. Henry Bakers, a prostitute named Malgas who'd disappeared months earlier, another street child named Zweli Mchemla. The names kept coming, each accompanied by descriptions of such depravity that detectives found themselves needing breaks from the interview room, stepping outside to breathe fresh air, to remember that humanity existed beyond the horror Wilkin was calmly describing. He confessed to at least 7 murders, though investigators suspected the true number was higher. Some bodies were never found despite Wilkin leading police to approximate locations. Years of exposure to elements, scavengers, and natural decomposition had erased evidence of crimes that Wilkin described in vivid detail but couldn't precisely prove. The confessions revealed patterns investigators hadn't fully recognized. Wilkin targeted victims based on vulnerability and opportunity rather than physical type. He didn't discriminate by gender. Both male and female victims appeared in his list. Age mattered only in terms of physical vulnerability. He killed children and adults with equal ruthlessness. What united his victims was their marginal social status, their lack of powerful advocates, their existence on society's edges where disappearances might go unnoticed or uninvestigated. But the most chilling aspect of Wilkin's confessions wasn't the details of the murders themselves. It was his affect while describing them. Psychologists who evaluated him noted a complete absence of empathy, remorse, or emotional connection to his actions. He spoke about killing human beings with less emotion than most people display when discussing traffic delays. His victims weren't people to him. They were objects that served a purpose, satisfied a need, then ceased to be relevant. Understanding Stuart Wilkin requires descending into psychological territory where human behavior becomes almost incomprehensible. This wasn't a man who killed in fits of rage or temporary insanity. He wasn't driven by delusions or hallucinations. Wilkin operated with full awareness of his actions, making calculated decisions, planning his crimes with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Dr. Sean Kaliski, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Wilkin extensively, described him as displaying profound antisocial personality disorder combined with necrophilic and pedophilic paraphilias. Translation: Wilkin's brain functioned fundamentally differently from normal human neurology. The regions responsible for empathy, emotional regulation, and moral reasoning showed patterns consistent with severe personality disorders. He wasn't technically psychotic. He understood reality clearly, but his emotional landscape was so distorted that conventional human motivations didn't apply. The origins of this psychological catastrophe trace back to his childhood trauma. The sexual assault by his father at age 7 occurred during a critical developmental window when the brain is forming neural pathways that govern sexual behavior, emotional bonding, and stress response. That trauma literally rewired Wilkin's developing mind, creating associations between sexuality, violence, and power that became fundamental to his psychological architecture. But trauma alone doesn't create serial killers. Millions of people experience horrific childhoods without becoming murderers. Wilkin possessed additional factors: genetic predispositions toward low empathy, neurological abnormalities in his prefrontal cortex, and environmental conditions that reinforced rather than challenged his developing pathology. He was, in the cruelest sense, a perfect storm of biological, psychological, and social factors that coalesced into something monstrous. His sexual deviance manifested in necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses. This isn't uncommon among serial killers who seek complete control over their victims. A corpse cannot resist, cannot judge, cannot threaten the fragile ego structures that many sexual predators possess. For Wilkin, the transition from murder to necrophilic acts represented the ultimate expression of power and domination. Interviews with Wilkin revealed his internal logic, which operated on principles alien to normal human psychology. He didn't view his victims as individuals with lives, dreams, families, futures. They were, in his own words, things that served a purpose. The purpose varied, sometimes sexual gratification, sometimes the psychological release that came from exerting absolute control, sometimes simply because the urge existed and opportunity presented itself. He expressed no genuine remorse during psychological evaluations. When prompted to discuss his victim's suffering, he responded with clinical detachment, as if being asked to comment on abstract concepts rather than actual human pain he'd caused. Psychologists noted that his expressions of regret, when they occurred, were performative, learned responses he'd observed in others rather than authentic emotional experiences. The question of why he killed his own son remains partially unanswered. Wilkin offered multiple explanations over the years, none entirely convincing. One version claimed Juan had discovered pornographic material related to children in their home and confronted his father. Another suggested the boy had witnessed suspicious behavior and asked too many questions. A third, darkest version implied that Juan himself had become an object of his father's sexual deviance. Investigators ultimately concluded that the truth likely combined elements of all three explanations. Juan represented both a threat to Wilkins' secrecy and a potential victim who lived in close proximity. In Wilkins' fractured psyche, those factors merged into deadly inevitability. The murder of his son represented a complete severing of whatever vestigial humanity might have remained in Wilkins' psychological makeup. Port Elizabeth's community struggled to comprehend how such a monster had operated among them undetected. Neighbors interviewed after his arrest expressed shock. He'd seemed so normal, so ordinary. He'd helped people with car troubles, participated in neighborhood watch programs, attended community events. The cognitive dissonance between the helpful neighbor and the serial killer was too vast for many to bridge. This speaks to a broader truth about dangerous predators. They don't look like monsters. They look like everyone else. They've learned to mimic human behavior with sufficient accuracy to blend in, to earn trust, to access victims. Wilkins' ability to maintain his mask for years demonstrated intelligence and planning that made him far more dangerous than impulsive killers who get caught quickly. His wife Sulfina faced perhaps the cruelest revelation. The man she'd married, shared a bed with, raised children with, had murdered their son and numerous others while maintaining the facade of concerned father and husband. She'd lived with a monster for years without recognizing it. The psychological trauma of that realization required extensive therapy and support that was tragically inadequate given South Africa's limited mental health resources. During his trial preparation, psychologists debated whether Wilkins could be classified as legally insane. The legal definition of insanity requires that the defendant cannot distinguish right from wrong or understand the nature of their actions. Wilkins clearly understood both. He concealed his crimes, avoided detection, disposed of evidence, all actions demonstrating awareness of wrongdoing and desire to avoid consequences. The conclusion: Stuart Wilkins was deeply, profoundly psychologically damaged, but he was not insane by legal standards. He was a monster, but a monster who understood morality and chose to ignore it, who recognized human suffering and felt no compulsion to prevent it, who saw other people as objects to be used and discarded according to his needs. This distinction matters because it shaped his legal fate. An insanity finding would have meant psychiatric hospitalization with potential for eventual release if deemed cured. But Wilkins couldn't be cured because he wasn't sick in a treatable sense. His psychology was fundamentally structured around predation, violence, and violation. No amount of therapy would restructure neural pathways formed during childhood trauma and reinforced through years of violent behavior. Stuart Wilkins' trial began in 1998, and from the first day, it gripped South Africa's attention with horrifying intensity. The courtroom in Port Elizabeth's High Court became a theater where evil was documented, examined, and ultimately judged. Prosecutors presented their case methodically. Forensic evidence, witness testimony, and most damningly, Wilkins' own confessions. The evidence was overwhelming and nauseating. Forensic pathologists testified about the condition of recovered bodies, describing injuries so severe that even experienced medical professionals struggled to maintain composure. Soil samples, fiber evidence, and DNA analysis placed Wilkins at multiple crime scenes with scientific certainty that left little room for reasonable doubt. But the confessions themselves formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Wilkins had detailed his crimes with such specificity that investigators verified facts only the killer could have known. He described victims' clothing, the locations of burial sites, specific details about the murders that matched forensic findings. Defense attorneys tried to challenge the confession's admissibility, arguing coercion or psychological instability, but the court ruled that Wilkins had confessed voluntarily and with full understanding of his rights. Victim impact statements gutted everyone present. Parents of murdered children took the stand, describing their babies, their hopes and dreams, the devastation of loss. They spoke about birthdays that would never be celebrated, graduations that would never happen, grandchildren who would never be born. Their grief filled the courtroom like toxic gas, suffocating in its intensity. One mother described finding her son's body, how she'd had to identify him through dental records because decomposition and scavenger activity had rendered his face unrecognizable. She spoke about nightmares that never ended, about seeing her child's terrified face in every crowd, about the guilt that consumed her for not protecting him from the monster who'd been hiding in plain sight. Sulfina testified as well, though her testimony was complicated. She'd lost her son to the same monster she'd shared a life with. Prosecutors treated her gently, recognizing that she was both a witness and a victim. She described Wilkins' behavior before and after Juan's disappearance, the inconsistencies she'd noticed but rationalized away, the lies he'd told with such conviction that she'd believed them completely. Defense attorneys faced an impossible task. The evidence was irrefutable, the confessions damning, the crimes beyond justification. Their strategy focused on mitigating factors: Wilkins' childhood trauma, his psychological disorders, arguments for life imprisonment rather than execution. They brought in psychological experts who testified about his damaged mental state, about how early trauma had fractured his developing psyche. But mitigation only goes so far when confronted with crimes of such magnitude. Wilkin hadn't killed once in a moment of passion or temporary insanity. He'd killed repeatedly, methodically, choosing victims deliberately, planning each murder, disposing of bodies, then returning to normal life without apparent stress or guilt. The pattern demonstrated not just criminal intent but sustained predatory behavior over years. The prosecution called for the death penalty, which was still legal in South Africa at the time, though under active debate. They argued that Wilkin represented an ongoing threat to society, that his crimes were so heinous and his psychology so fundamentally twisted that no punishment short of execution could serve justice. The death penalty debate added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged trial. Judge Binsward, who presided over the case, faced a decision that would define his career. The evidence demanded conviction, that much was clear. But what sentence adequately addressed crimes of this magnitude? Could any punishment truly serve justice for victims and their families? Could society be protected from Wilkin while still upholding principles of humane treatment even for monsters? On October 7, 1997, the judge delivered his verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions. Relief from victims' families, tears, angry shouts directed at Wilkin, who sat expressionless in the dock, displaying the same eerie calm he'd maintained throughout the trial. For sentencing, Judge Binsward delivered a scathing assessment of Wilkin's character and crimes. He spoke about the brutality of the murders, the vulnerability of the victims, the calculated nature of Wilkin's predation. He noted the absence of genuine remorse, the complete lack of empathy, the chilling calm with which Wilkin had described killing human beings. The sentence: 7 life terms plus an additional 50 years for various crimes including murder, rape, and indecent assault. By the time the judge finished reading the sentence, Wilkin had been condemned to die in prison. Even if parole were theoretically possible, the cumulative sentence structure made it effectively impossible. Stuart Wilkin would never walk free again. But there was a twist. In 1995, South Africa had abolished the death penalty in all circumstances. Wilkin had been sentenced after that abolition, meaning execution was never an option despite the prosecution's requests. For some victims' families, this felt like incomplete justice. They wanted Wilkin dead, wanted him to experience a fraction of the terror his victims had felt in their final moments. Others found relief in life imprisonment. Death would end Wilkin's suffering quickly. Life in prison meant decades of confinement, of time to contemplate his actions, of growing old in a cage. From this perspective, extended imprisonment represented a more severe punishment than a quick execution. Wilkin was transported to CMAX, a maximum security facility in Pretoria designed for South Africa's most dangerous criminals. There, he would spend 23 hours per day in a small cell with 1 hour for exercise in a confined courtyard. No contact with other prisoners. No participation in general population activities. Effective solitary confinement for the rest of his natural life. Reports from prison staff describe Wilkin as a model prisoner in terms of behavior. He follows rules, doesn't cause disturbances, engages politely with guards. But correctional psychologists who monitor him note that this compliance is performative rather than genuine rehabilitation. He's playing the role of reformed prisoner the same way he once played the role of normal citizen. In rare interviews conducted years after his conviction, Wilkin continues to display the same disturbing lack of emotional connection to his crimes. He speaks about his victims in clinical terms, discusses his actions with detachment, occasionally expresses what sound like regrets but which psychological evaluators classify as performative rather than authentic. The monster who killed children and violated corpses still exists behind those calm eyes. He's simply contained now. The Boadi Boer case transformed South African law enforcement approaches to serial crime. Prior to Wilkin, police had limited resources and training for identifying and tracking serial offenders. The investigation into his crimes revealed systematic failures, missing persons reports that weren't properly investigated, patterns that went unrecognized, victims whose deaths might have been prevented with better interdepartmental communication. In response, South Africa developed specialized units trained in serial crime investigation, improved database systems for tracking missing persons, and established protocols for identifying patterns in violent crime. These changes came too late for Wilkin's victims, but they've helped prevent or solve other cases in the decades since. Port Elizabeth itself struggled with the psychological aftermath. The community where Wilkin had operated faced a collective trauma. Their neighbors, their streets, their city had harbored a monster, and nobody had noticed until bodies started accumulating. Parents became more vigilant about their children's whereabouts. Street children, already marginalized, faced increased suspicion and harassment from communities now hyper-aware of vulnerability and predation. Victims' families carry scars that will never fully heal. They live with absence. Empty chairs at holiday dinners, bedrooms that remain unchanged decades later, photographs that freeze their loved ones in time while the world moves on without them. Some found solace in support groups, in therapy, in activism aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Others never recovered, their lives effectively ending when their children's did. Sulfina divorced Wilkin and attempted to rebuild a life shattered by betrayal and loss. She faced public scrutiny. How could she not have known? The question haunted her, though those who understand predatory psychology recognize that skilled manipulators can deceive even those closest to them. She changed her name, moved away from Port Elizabeth, tried to create distance from the nightmare her marriage had become. As of 2025, Stuart Wilkin remains imprisoned at CMAX. He's now in his late 50s, aging in a cell, serving a sentence that will only end with his death. The monster has been caged, but he hasn't been defeated or reformed. The psychological structures that drove him to kill remain intact, merely prevented from acting by physical confinement. His case continues to be studied in criminal psychology programs worldwide. Researchers examine his patterns, his psychology, his methods, trying to understand how people become capable of such evil. The goal isn't to excuse or justify, but to identify warning signs, to develop intervention strategies, to prevent the next Stuart Wilkin from emerging. The name Boadi Boer lingers in South African consciousness, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious malevolence. Sometimes it wears an ordinary face, lives on your street, helps you jumpstart your car. The real horror of Stuart Wilkin isn't just what he did, but how easily he did it, how long he went undetected, how many people he fooled into seeing humanity where only a void existed. Tonight, we've descended into that void, examined the monster who wore a human face, and confronted the uncomfortable truth that people like Stuart Wilkin exist among us. They're out there right now wearing masks of normalcy, identifying victims, planning their next moves. The hunt never truly ends. It simply shifts to the next predator, the next investigation, the next case that reminds us that monsters are real, and sometimes they're the last person you'd suspect. Stuart Wilkin is locked away, but the darkness he represented remains. And somewhere, in some city, on some street, another predator is learning from his mistakes, perfecting the mask, preparing to hunt. That's the nightmare we live with, the truth that true crime forces us to confront. The monster might be anyone, anywhere, at any time, and the only defense is vigilance, awareness, and the determination to never stop hunting the hunters. The Boety Boar's story ends in a cage. But the lesson it teaches us, that evil hides in plain sight, that predators perfect disguise, that complacency enables horror, that lesson continues. And it's a lesson we can never afford to forget. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Thousand Devils of Halberstadt. They knelt before a monster and called it holy. For decades, the children of Halberstadt whispered their sins to a man who collected depravity like other priests collected alms. Simon Bingelhelm wore the robes of salvation while orchestrating a symphony of suffering so vast, so methodical, that when the truth finally clawed its way into daylight, the number of his victims defied comprehension. 1,000 souls, maybe more, lost to a predator who weaponized faith itself. This is the story of the wolf who wore shepherd's clothing so convincingly that an entire town fed him their lambs, one confession at a time. And when the mask finally slipped, hell had already made its home on consecrated ground. The cobblestone streets of Halberstadt twisted through centuries of history, each stone worn smooth by generations of faithful footsteps. The cathedral's twin spires pierced the gray German sky like accusing fingers, casting long shadows across the medieval town square where merchants hawked their wares and children played games older than memory. The year was 1540, and the winds of religious upheaval howled through every corner of the Holy Roman Empire. Martin Luther's Reformation had torn the fabric of certainty apart. Where once there had been the monolithic authority of Rome, now there existed fractures, schisms, theological battlegrounds where neighbor turned against neighbor over the interpretation of Scripture. Towns like Halberstadt found themselves caught between the old world and the new, between Catholic tradition and Protestant revolution. It was a time of spiritual chaos, of questioning, of vulnerability. And Simon Bingelhelm understood vulnerability the way a shark understands blood in water. He arrived during this tumult, a young priest with soft eyes and a gentler smile. His credentials seemed impeccable, ordained properly, educated at respected institutions, bearing letters of recommendation that spoke of his devotion and his particular gift for working with young people. The church elders, desperate for stability during such uncertain times, welcomed him with relief bordering on gratitude. Father Bingelhelm was everything they needed, patient where others showed frustration, gentle where others demonstrated sternness. He had a particular way with children, a talent for making even the most timid child feel safe, seen, understood. Parents noticed how their sons and daughters emerged from confession with lightened spirits, how they spoke of Father Bingelhelm with genuine affection rather than the fearful respect typically accorded to clergy. The priest established himself quickly within the community's fabric. He visited the sick without being summoned, brought comfort to the grieving without expecting recognition, and organized youth programs that kept restless adolescents engaged with the church. His sermons struck a careful balance between the traditional Catholic teachings and an acknowledgement of the questions Luther had raised, a diplomatic approach that appealed to a community weary of theological warfare. He was particularly devoted to the confessional. The wooden booth became his throne, his hunting ground, his laboratory, the architecture of Catholic confession, the darkness, the anonymity, the sacred seal of secrecy, provided perfect camouflage for what he truly was. Behind the lattice screen, Bingelhelm listened. But more than that, he learned. He studied. He cataloged every weakness, every fear, every shameful secret that tumbled from young lips seeking absolution. The confessional booth at St. Martin's Church was an ancient thing, carved from dark oak that had absorbed centuries of whispered sins. The wood seemed to hold darkness even in daylight, and the small space smelled of beeswax candles and accumulated guilt. When the door closed, the world disappeared. There was only the kneeler, hard against young knees, and the shadow of Father Bingelhelm's profile behind the screen. "Speak, my child," he would say, his voice honey-smooth. "God listens without judgment. So do I." And they spoke, because that's what you did. Because the church taught that confession cleansed the soul, that secrets spoken in that sacred space vanished like morning mist, carried away by divine mercy. They confessed their small cruelties to siblings, their impure thoughts, their doubts about faith, their fears about the changing world outside. They confessed everything. What they didn't know was that Bingelhelm kept records. Hidden within his private chambers, locked away in a chest only he could access, were pages upon pages of meticulous notes. Names, ages, confessions, weaknesses. He wrote in cipher, a code he'd developed himself, transforming innocent admissions into intelligence, into ammunition. The boy who confessed to touching himself. The girl who admitted hatred for her stepfather. The adolescent struggling with attractions he didn't understand. All of it catalogued and preserved. The seal of confession, that sacred vow that what was spoken in the booth could never be revealed, became his greatest weapon. Because who would believe that a priest would violate such a fundamental tenet? Who would imagine that the gentle Father Bingelhelm used these secrets not to guide souls toward salvation, but to identify the most vulnerable, the most isolated, the most easily manipulated? 3 years passed. Bingelhelm's reputation grew. He became Halberstadt's most beloved priest, the one parents specifically requested for their children's religious education, the one who seemed to understand the particular struggles of youth during these troubled times, the one who never raised his voice, never wielded his authority like a cudgel, never made faith feel like punishment. He was perfect, too perfect, but perfection is often just a mask worn long enough that people forget to look for the face underneath. The grooming was exquisite in its patience. Bingelhelm never rushed. He understood that the most secure traps required the most careful construction. He began with small gestures, a hand on a shoulder that lingered just slightly too long, a compliment that felt slightly too personal, attention that made a child feel special, chosen, important. He identified the ones who needed it most, the fatherless boys, the girls whose mothers were too busy with younger siblings, the children who felt invisible in large families or stifled in strict ones. He offered them escape. The church library became a sanctuary where he would read to them, his voice painting pictures of saints and martyrs, of suffering that led to glory. His private chambers became a place where special students could study advanced catechism. The evening walks through the church gardens became opportunities for deeper conversations about faith and doubt and the nature of God's love. "You're different from the others," he would say, and a child's heart would swell with pride. "God has plans for you. I can see it. You're meant for something greater." The isolation was gradual, a suggestion that perhaps they shouldn't mention their special lessons to parents who might not understand. A gentle warning that other children might become jealous of the attention. A reminder that their conversations were sacred, protected by the same seal as confession. Slowly, invisibly, he erected walls between his chosen victims and the world that might protect them. The first touches were equally gradual, an embrace that lasted too long, fingers brushing against skin under the guise of adjustment or instruction. The planting of seeds that this was normal, appropriate, an expression of spiritual love. He framed everything in religious language. God's love made manifest through physical comfort, the importance of trust between shepherd and lamb, the special bond between priest and devoted student. And if a child seemed uncomfortable, Bingelhelm had already prepared for that. He knew their secrets, remembered their confessions. A quiet reminder of something shameful they'd admitted could silence questions before they formed into words. A gentle suggestion that perhaps their own sinful thoughts were making them interpret innocent affection as something else. The confusion, the self-doubt, the fear of being disbelieved, all of it worked in his favor. The children of Halberstadt had been taught since birth to trust priests implicitly. The church represented absolute moral authority. To question a priest was to question God himself. Bingelhelm exploited this conditioning with surgical precision. He transformed faith itself into a weapon, turned devotion into chains, made piety synonymous with silence. By 1543, his system was fully operational. The confessional fed him intelligence. His reputation provided access. The religious structure ensured compliance and secrecy. He had created a perfect machine for predation, powered by the very institution meant to protect innocence. The town square remained peaceful. Markets bustled. Families prayed together. The Reformation debates continued in scholarly circles and tavern arguments. Life proceeded normally in Halberstadt, the surface calm and unremarkable. But in the shadows of St. Martin's Church, in the darkness behind closed doors, in the silent screams that children swallowed because they had no words for what was being done to them, another reality existed. A reality where the man they called Father devoured souls systematically, methodically, without remorse or hesitation. The most terrifying predators are the ones we invite into our homes, the ones we teach our children to trust without question, the ones whose masks are so convincing that we cannot imagine the monsters wearing them. Simon Bingelhelm had perfected his disguise. He had built his infrastructure. He had identified his hunting grounds and secured his supply of victims. The 1,000 devils of Halberstadt weren't coming. They were already there, hidden behind one man's gentle smile, waiting in the confessional booth, lurking in every private lesson and evening walk. And they were hungry, endlessly, insatiably hungry. The town slept peacefully, unaware that its shepherd had become a wolf, unaware that the church bells calling them to worship also rang dinner bells for a predator who had just begun his feast. The pattern emerged slowly, too slowly for anyone to recognize it as a pattern at all. Individual threads of trauma, separated by time and secrecy, woven into a tapestry of horror so vast that no single observer could perceive its full scope. In the winter of 1543, 11-year-old Klaus Zimmermann began having nightmares. His mother, a washerwoman who worked herself to exhaustion in the cold Halberstadt mornings, noticed his withdrawn behavior but attributed it to the harshness of the season, to the hunger that gnawed at poor families when winter stores ran low. Klaus stopped eating properly. He flinched at sudden movements. His eyes carried a haunted quality that seemed wrong on such a young face. When his mother pressed him, Klaus said nothing. How could he? Father Bingelhelm had explained very carefully that their special relationship was sacred, protected by God himself. That to speak of it would be a sin worse than any Klaus could imagine. That Klaus's own impure nature, confessed in the booth months earlier, made him complicit, made him guilty, made him unworthy of being believed even if he dared to speak. The priest had been very clear about this. Across town, 14-year-old Greta Hoffmann had stopped attending Mass entirely. Her father, a blacksmith with a temper sharpened by drink, beat her for this defiance, but still she refused. The alternative, seeing Father Bingelhelm's face, hearing his voice, being within reach of his hands, was worse than any punishment her father could devise. She took the beatings silently, because explaining the real reason would mean describing things she had no language for, admitting to acts her father would surely blame her for, destroying the last fragments of her family's standing in the community. So she said nothing and endured the bruises that at least made sense, that at least came from expected sources of violence. In the church's youth choir, 15-year-old Johann Kraus sang hymns with a voice that was beginning to crack and deepen. Father Bingelhelm had taken special interest in Johann's musical development, offering private lessons in the organ loft where the massive pipes created acoustic privacy, where screams would be swallowed by stone and wood. Johann's hands trembled when he played now, mistakes creeping into passages he'd once performed flawlessly. "You're distracted," Bingelhelm would chide gently, his breath hot against Johann's ear. "We'll need more practice, longer sessions, until you learn proper discipline." And Johann would nod, because what else could he do? The priest had already explained how Johann's own sins, his theft of a loaf of bread the previous year, his violent thoughts toward his abusive older brother, made him untrustworthy, made him the kind of person no one would believe, made him deserving of punishment rather than pity. The machinery of Bingelhelm's operation ran on this precise fuel. Shame, confusion, religious authority, and the fundamental isolation of each victim who believed they were the only one, who had been convinced that their situation was unique, was their own fault, was unspeakable. But the priest's appetites were escalating. What had begun as careful, measured predation was evolving into something more reckless, more frequent, more severe. The power he wielded had become intoxicating. The thrill of corruption, of taking innocence and twisting it into complicity, had grown addictive. He was no longer satisfied with the slow corruption of a few chosen victims. He wanted more. He wanted to see how far he could push, how many he could claim, how completely he could dominate the vulnerable souls entrusted to his care. The confessional remained his primary recruitment tool, but he expanded his methodology. He began organizing overnight religious retreats at a monastery in the countryside, events where particularly devout youths could deepen their spiritual education away from the distractions of daily life. Parents felt honored when their children were selected for these retreats, seeing it as recognition of their family's piety. They didn't know that these isolated locations, far from protective eyes, gave Bingelhelm uninterrupted access to multiple victims simultaneously. That the monastery's thick walls and remote location meant that any sounds of distress would dissipate harmlessly into the surrounding forest. That the other monks there were either complicit, willfully blind, or had their own reasons for maintaining silence about the peculiar activities occurring during these youth retreats. The countryside monastery became a laboratory where Bingelhelm refined his techniques of psychological manipulation and physical violation. He discovered that group dynamics could be weaponized, that forcing victims to witness each other's abuse created a collective shame that reinforced silence more effectively than individual threats ever could, that making older victims complicit in the grooming of younger ones bound them all together in a conspiracy of enforced quiet. He learned that pain could be administered in ways that left no visible marks, that terror could be calibrated precisely, that a child's mind could be fractured and reformed into something compliant, something that believed its own suffering was deserved, was necessary, was a form of spiritual purification. During these retreats, Bingelhelm would lead the children in prayers that lasted hours, keeping them exhausted and disoriented. He would preach about the sinful nature of the flesh, about the importance of mortification, about how suffering brought them closer to Christ's own agony. He would describe the torments of hell in vivid detail, the eternal flames, the demons with their implements of torture, the screaming multitudes who had failed to properly atone for their sins. And then he would offer salvation, protection, a special dispensation from God, channeled through him, that could spare them from such horrors. All they needed to do was accept his guidance completely, submit to his authority without question, trust that every act, no matter how confusing or painful, served a higher spiritual purpose. The children's minds, already primed by religious education to accept incomprehensible divine mysteries, to embrace suffering as virtue, to surrender will to higher authority, were fertile ground for such indoctrination. Bingelhelm wasn't just abusing bodies. He was colonizing souls, rewriting their fundamental understanding of right and wrong, trust and betrayal, love and violation. By 1545, the scope of his predation had grown exponentially. He had created a network of silence that spanned dozens of families. Some victims had aged out of his preferred targets and entered adolescence carrying secrets that poisoned their development, their relationships, their ability to form healthy bonds with others. New victims entered his orbit constantly, drawn by his reputation as Halberstadt's most dedicated youth minister. The church elders praised his tireless work with young people. Parents felt blessed that their children received such attentive spiritual guidance. The community saw only the surface, a devoted priest whose selflessness bordered on saintly, who gave endless hours to the moral education of Halberstadt's youth. They didn't see the boy who stopped speaking entirely for 6 months after a retreat, who was beaten by his frustrated parents for his stubborn silence when in reality trauma had stolen his voice. They didn't see the girl who developed a washing compulsion so severe that her hands bled from constant scrubbing, trying to clean away the filth that she'd been convinced was her own sinful nature. They didn't see the adolescent who attempted to castrate himself with a stolen knife, believing that removing his sinful flesh was the only path to redemption. These individual tragedies remained isolated, separated by the walls of privacy that surrounded family shame. No one connected the dots. No one recognized that all of these suffering children shared one common thread: Father Simon Bingelhelm. The priest's confidence grew with each successful silencing, each new victim claimed without consequence. He began to believe himself untouchable, protected by both divine authority and community trust. He started taking more risks, abuse occurring not just in isolated locations but in the church itself, in his chambers during regular hours, in the confession booth where the line between spiritual and physical penetration blurred into blasphemy. He developed favorites, children he returned to repeatedly, whose compliance he had secured so thoroughly that he could summon them at will. These were the ones most completely broken, whose identities had been so thoroughly rewritten that they no longer distinguished between abuse and affection, between violation and love. Some of them clung to him desperately, their traumatized psyches unable to comprehend that the source of their suffering and the source of their comfort were the same person. This is what prolonged abuse does. It creates bonds more powerful than chains, bonds forged from confused attachment and survival instinct, from the desperate need to believe that the pain serves some purpose, means something might eventually transform into the actual love it mimics. Bingelhelm kept his meticulous records, his coded journal entries documenting each encounter with clinical detachment. Names, dates, acts performed, psychological responses observed. He was methodical even in his monstrosity, treating his predation as a form of research of catalog creation. In his twisted logic, he wasn't destroying these children but rather conducting a grand experiment in the malleability of innocence, the boundaries of control, the extent to which faith could be weaponized against the faithful. The seasons turned. Spring brought festivals. Summer brought harvests. Autumn brought preparation for winter's hardships. And through it all, the machinery of suffering churned invisibly, grinding young souls into trauma that would echo through their entire lives. By the winter of 1546, Bingelhelm's victim count had likely exceeded 100 children. The precise number was unknowable. Even his records weren't complete, as some encounters were opportunistic rather than planned, some victims too young or too traumatized to have registered as distinct individuals in his catalog of conquered innocence. But the machinery, no matter how perfectly designed, had an inherent flaw. Complexity breeds vulnerability. The more victims he claimed, the more threads existed that could unravel his carefully constructed facade. The more witnesses to his nature existed, the greater the probability that someone would speak, would be believed, would pierce the veil of religious authority that protected him. He had built an empire on silence, but silence is never permanent. It's a dam holding back an ocean of truth, and dams eventually crack under pressure. The question wasn't whether his crimes would be exposed, but when, and what would finally provide the catalyst for revelation. That catalyst was coming, though Bingelhelm didn't know it yet. It was approaching in the form of one victim whose breaking point would finally shatter the conspiracy of quiet, whose pain would become the hammer that brought down the walls of secrecy. The machinery of suffering was about to jam, to grind to a halt, to explode into visibility. And when it did, Halberstadt would discover that the monster they had nurtured in their midst made the theological devils they feared seem almost merciful by comparison. Snow fell softly on Halberstadt the night 16-year-old Matthias Brenner decided that death was preferable to one more day of living with what Father Bingelhelm had done to him. The Brenner family lived above their shop on Schmiedstrasse, where Matthias's father crafted horseshoes and farm implements that were renowned throughout the region for their quality. They were a respected family, modestly prosperous, regular in their church attendance. Matthias was their eldest son, a serious boy who had once spoken eagerly about potentially entering the priesthood himself, a fact that had made Father Bingelhelm's eyes gleam with particular interest 3 years earlier. The abuse had begun when Matthias was 13, at that vulnerable age between childhood and manhood when identity remains fluid, when guidance from respected authorities shapes the person you'll become. Bingelhelm had been patient with Matthias, recognizing something valuable in the boy's intelligence and intensity. The grooming had been exquisite, the manipulation surgical in its precision. By 16, Matthias barely recognized himself. The boy who had once dreamed of holy orders now couldn't enter a church without vomiting. The youth who had been gentle and studious had become volatile, prone to violent outbursts followed by periods of catatonic withdrawal. His father attributed this to adolescent rebellion and responded with increasingly harsh discipline, never suspecting that he was punishing the symptoms of trauma rather than simple disobedience. That winter night, Matthias climbed to the shop's roof. The snow had rendered the slate tiles treacherous, and the drop to the cobblestones below was more than sufficient for his purpose. He stood at the edge, looking down at the street where lamplight reflected off the white accumulation, creating a peaceful scene utterly at odds with the chaos inside his skull. The cold bit through his thin nightshirt, but he barely felt it. Physical discomfort had become meaningless after years of being taught that his body was simply an object, a thing to be used, that his pain and pleasure existed only as data points in Father Bingelhelm's ongoing experiment in domination. Matthias thought about his younger brother, Leopold, who at 11 had recently begun receiving special attention from Father Bingelhelm. The priest had mentioned it casually to Matthias last week. "Your brother shows such promise. Perhaps he'll need the same guidance you received, the same careful instruction." The implication had been crystal clear. The cycle would continue. Leopold would suffer what Matthias had suffered, would be broken the way Matthias had been broken, unless something stopped it. But what could stop it? Who would believe him? Father Bingelhelm was beloved, trusted, protected by layers of institutional authority and community respect. Matthias was damaged goods, a troubled youth with a reputation for instability. Any accusation he made would be dismissed as delusion or malicious invention, would likely result in punishment for bearing false witness against a priest. Unless the thought struck him with such force that he actually stumbled backward from the roof's edge, his foot sliding on the snow before he caught himself. Unless the accusation came from someone the community couldn't dismiss. Unless the evidence was so overwhelming, so undeniable, that not even religious authority could deflect it. Unless Matthias could find others who shared his experience, could build a case too substantial to ignore. He climbed down from the roof with new purpose, though his hands shook so badly that he nearly fell twice. The suicidal impulse hadn't vanished entirely. It lurked in the background of his thoughts like a predator waiting for weakness, but it had been momentarily overshadowed by something else. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for what he felt. It was more like desperate determination, the kind that emerges when someone realizes they have nothing left to lose. The next day, Matthias began his investigation. He started watching the church from a distance, observing patterns he had been too close to see clearly before. He noted which children received special attention from Father Bingelhelm, which ones emerged from private meetings with that peculiar combination of shame and dissociation that Matthias recognized from his own reflection. He saw it in 12-year-old Anna Dietrich, who had once been bright and talkative but now kept her eyes downcast and flinched at unexpected sounds. He saw it in the Weber twins, 14-year-old boys who had stopped speaking to each other entirely after separate spiritual counseling sessions with the priest. He saw it in at least a dozen others, maybe more, all bearing the invisible marks of Bingelhelm's attention. But seeing it and proving it were entirely different challenges. The children wouldn't speak. Matthias understood that better than anyone. The shame was too deep, the confusion too profound, the threats too effective. He needed another approach. He needed Bingelhelm's records. Matthias had seen the priest's coded journal once, years ago, during one of their sessions in Bingelhelm's private chambers. The priest had been careless that day, leaving the leather-bound book visible on his desk. At the time, Matthias hadn't understood its significance. Now, he recognized it as potential evidence, documentation that might corroborate accusations, might provide undeniable proof of systemic abuse. Breaking into the priest's chambers would be suicidal if discovered. It would also be necessary. Matthias spent 2 weeks planning. He learned the rhythms of the church, when the building was occupied and when it stood empty. He identified a window in the sacristy that closed imperfectly, leaving a gap large enough to accommodate a slender frame. He waited for an evening when Father Bingelhelm was scheduled to attend a clerical meeting in a neighboring town, an overnight absence that would provide crucial time. On the chosen night, Matthias told his parents he was staying with a friend. Instead, he waited in the shadows near St. Martin's Church, watching until the last evening prayers concluded and the building emptied. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by once his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The sacristy window yielded to careful pressure, the ancient hinges protesting softly but not loud enough to attract attention. Matthias slipped through the gap and dropped into the darkness beyond, his heart hammering so violently that he feared it might be audible in the church's profound silence. The stone building held cold like a tomb holds corpses. His breath plumed visibly in the dim moonlight filtering through stained glass windows that transformed it into ghosts of color, blood reds and bruised purples playing across the floor. Every step he took seemed thunderous. Every creak of old would a scream announcing his intrusion. Father Bingelhelm's chambers were locked, but Matthias had anticipated this. He had stolen his father's lock-picking tools, simple implements used to repair stuck church locks, a service the blacksmith sometimes provided. His hands shook so badly that his first 3 attempts failed, precious minutes evaporating while he fumbled with the mechanism. Finally, something shifted. The lock surrendered with a click that sounded like a cannon blast in the silence. The priest's private room smelled of incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Matthias tried not to identify. A single window admitted moonlight that revealed a space more austere than he'd expected. A narrow bed, a desk, a chest, a small shelf of books. Everything precisely ordered, almost monastic in its simplicity. But Matthias knew that monsters often keep their true nature hidden behind unremarkable facades. He started with the desk, rifling through papers with increasing desperation. Letters, sermon notes, financial records, nothing incriminating. He moved to the chest, which was locked more substantially than the door had been. This lock resisted his tools, refused to yield despite his increasingly frantic efforts. Time was passing. The moon had traveled visibly across the sky since he'd entered. If someone discovered him here, the consequences would be catastrophic. He was about to give up when his eyes fell on a loose stone in the wall near the bed, something slightly out of alignment with its neighbors. Investigating closer, he discovered that it could be removed, revealing a cavity behind it. Inside the hidden space was the leather-bound journal he remembered, along with several other documents and a small wooden box whose contents rattled when he lifted it. Matthias opened the journal with trembling hands, tilting it toward the moonlight to make out the writing within. The text was coded, the strange symbols meaningless to him initially. But as he flipped through pages, certain elements became recognizable. Dates, written in standard numerals. Names, which appeared to be substituted with numbers but followed patterns he could potentially decipher. And sketches, anatomical drawings that made his stomach revolt, technical diagrams of positions and acts that confirmed his worst understanding of what these records documented. This was it. This was proof. This was the evidence that could destroy Father Bingelhelm's facade. Matthias grabbed the journal and the accompanying documents, shoving them inside his shirt. The wooden box he opened quickly, then immediately wished he hadn't. Inside were trophies, locks of hair tied with ribbon, a child's small wooden cross, personal items that would mean nothing to anyone except their original owners and the predator who had collected them as souvenirs. He took the box as well, though touching it made his skin crawl. As he turned to leave, a sound froze him in place. Voices approaching from the main church. Multiple people, speaking in low tones that echoed strangely through the stone spaces. One voice he recognized immediately, Father Bingelhelm's smooth baritone, unmistakable even when distorted by distance and architecture. The priest had returned early. Panic descended like a physical weight, crushing rational thought. Matthias stood paralyzed as the voices grew closer, as footsteps approached down the corridor toward the private chambers. He had seconds, maybe less, before discovery. The window. He lunged toward it, fumbling with the latch as the voices reached the door. The mechanism stuck, refusing to open, and precious moments evaporated as he wrenched at it desperately. Behind him, the door handle began to turn. The window yielded suddenly, swinging outward with a squeal of metal. Matthias threw himself through the opening without checking the drop, hitting the ground outside hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his ankle as it twisted on the uneven stone, but terror overrode discomfort. He ran, limping and gasping, clutching the stolen evidence against his chest. Behind him, shouts erupted from the window he'd left gaping open. Father Bingelhelm's voice, no longer smooth but sharp with alarm, calling for pursuit. Matthias fled through Halberstadt's dark streets, every shadow a potential pursuer, every sound a threat. His injured ankle screamed protest with each impact, but he couldn't slow. The journal pressed against his ribs felt like both salvation and damnation, proof that could destroy a monster or, if Bingelhelm reclaimed it, ensure Matthias's own destruction. He needed safety, needed someone who would listen, who would look at what he'd stolen and understand its significance, who had authority enough to act on it. The town's burgher? Too closely aligned with the church. The magistrate? A close friend of Father Bingelhelm's. The other priests? Complicit through either active participation or willful blindness. Then he thought of Friedrich Kellermann. Kellermann was a traveling scholar, a Lutheran preacher who had recently arrived in Halberstadt to debate theological matters with the Catholic clergy. He had no ties to the local church hierarchy, no investment in protecting its reputation. More importantly, he had been openly critical of Catholic abuses, of the corruption he claimed had necessitated Luther's Reformation. If anyone might believe Matthias might act on this evidence, it would be Kellermann. The scholar was lodging at the Three Ravens Inn on the town's outskirts. Matthias altered his course, heading away from his own home and toward what might be either salvation or another betrayal. His lungs burned. His ankle felt like broken glass grinding against itself with every step. The shouts behind him seemed to be multiplying, though whether that was reality or paranoia he couldn't determine. He burst through the inn's door with enough force to send it crashing against the wall, startling the handful of late-night patrons. The innkeeper, a heavy woman with a face like weathered leather, moved to intercept him with obvious intent to eject this wild-eyed intruder. "Friedrich Kellermann," Matthias gasped. "I need Friedrich Kellermann. It's about the church, about Father Bingelhelm." Something in his voice, some quality of desperation too genuine to be performance, stopped the innkeeper's advance. She studied him for a moment with eyes that had seen enough of human nature to recognize truth when it came clawing through her door at midnight. "Third door on the left," she said quietly. "Top of the stairs." Matthias took them two at a time despite his damaged ankle, nearly falling twice. He pounded on the indicated door with both fists, not caring about noise anymore, not caring about anything except reaching safety before the pursuit caught him. The door opened to reveal a man in his 40s, wearing a nightshirt and holding a candle that illuminated a stern face framed by graying hair. Friedrich Kellermann looked more annoyed than concerned, until he saw Matthias's expression, saw the journal clutched against his chest like a shield. "Please," Matthias said, and his voice broke on the word. "Please, I have proof. About the priest. About what he's done. About what he's doing. Please, you have to." He couldn't finish the sentence. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was depleting, leaving behind only pain and exhaustion and the crushing weight of 3 years' trauma finally finding its voice. He collapsed forward, and Kellermann caught him, the journal and its damning contents falling to the floor between them. The scholar looked down at the leather-bound book, then back at the broken boy in his arms, and his face shifted from annoyance to grim understanding. He had seen this before in other towns, other communities where religious authority had been weaponized against the faithful. He recognized what Matthias represented even before examining the evidence. A crack in the wall of silence, a single voice finally screaming loud enough to be heard. "Come inside," Kellermann said quietly, his voice suddenly gentle. "Come inside and tell me everything." And as the door closed behind them, as Matthias began the agonizing process of translating horror into words, the machinery of suffering that had operated invisibly for so long finally ground to a halt. The revelation was beginning, the exposure that would transform Father Simon Bingelhelm from beloved shepherd into revealed monster. But revelations, like all births, are violent, painful affairs, and what was about to emerge into Halberstadt's light would be worse than anyone could have imagined. Dawn broke over Halberstadt like an accusation, pale light exposing a town about to discover that its foundations were built on buried screams. Friedrich Kellermann had not slept. He had spent the entire night listening to Matthias Brenner's testimony, examining the stolen journal, cross-referencing the coded entries against the boy's translations, and feeling his initial skepticism transform into horror then into fury so profound it became almost religious in its intensity. The journal was meticulous. Bingelhelm had documented years of systematic abuse with the detached precision of a natural philosopher conducting experiments. Each victim received a numbered designation. Each encounter was dated and described using coded language that, once Matthias provided the cipher key, revealed acts of such calculated cruelty that Kellerman, a man who had witnessed the worst of religious warfare, found himself physically ill. But the journal alone wouldn't be enough. Coded documents could be dismissed as fabrication, misinterpretation, the vengeful fantasy of a troubled youth. Kellerman understood that exposing institutional evil required more than evidence. It required a catalyst, a moment of undeniable revelation that shattered the protective blindness communities wrapped around their trusted authorities. He needed witnesses, multiple victims willing to speak publicly, to transform private trauma into collective testimony. And he needed to act quickly, before Bingelhelm could marshal the church's considerable resources to suppress the emerging truth. "How many others do you know?" Kellerman asked as the first light crept through the inn's window. "How many victims who might be willing to speak?" Matthias, exhausted beyond measure but sustained by grim purpose, considered the question. "Maybe a dozen I'm certain of, the ones I've observed, whose behavior matches mine. But convincing them to speak," he shook his head. "The shame is overwhelming, the fear of not being believed, the threats he made. I barely found the courage myself." "Then we must create conditions where courage becomes possible," Kellerman said, his mind already working through strategies. "We need an authority figure they trust, someone whose protection feels genuine. And we need to move before the church hierarchy closes ranks." He stood abruptly, decision crystallizing. "The regional bishop, Bishop Gottfried von Mulhausen. He's Lutheran now, converted during the Reformation, and he's been attempting to root out corruption within the transitioning churches. If we can present this to him directly, bypass the local church structure entirely, will he believe us?" Matthias asked, and the fragility in his voice revealed how much of his remaining hope depended on the answer. "I don't know," Kellerman answered honestly, "but he's our best chance." By mid-morning, they had crafted a letter, carefully worded, supported by specific details from the journal, requesting urgent audience on matters concerning the spiritual welfare of Halberstadt's youth. Kellerman dispatched it via his fastest courier, marked with the seals that indicated theological urgency, the kind of communication a bishop couldn't ignore without risk to his own authority. Meanwhile, Father Bingelhelm was conducting his own investigation. The theft from his chambers had sent him into barely controlled panic. The journal's loss represented existential threat. It was simultaneously proof of his crimes and evidence of his methodology, detailed enough that the right eyes reading it would understand exactly what he'd orchestrated. He had been careless, arrogant in his belief that his position made him untouchable. Now that arrogance might cost him everything. He knew immediately who the thief must be. Matthias Brenner had been behaving strangely for weeks, had been watching the church with obvious surveillance intent. The boy's intelligence made him dangerous. His deteriorating mental state made him unpredictable. Bingelhelm should have dealt with him more permanently when the signs first appeared. But the priest still had resources. The church infrastructure, the network of complicit silence, the community's reflexive trust. All of these could be mobilized to discredit a troubled youth's accusations. He began carefully planting seeds of doubt. Conversations with parents about Matthias's increasingly erratic behavior, suggestions that the boy might be experiencing spiritual crisis manifesting as delusions, gentle implications that mental instability ran in certain family lines. He also reached out to other clergy, those who shared his proclivities or who had reasons to ensure the status quo remained undisturbed. A coded letter went to the monastery where the retreats occurred, warning that scrutiny might be coming, that certain records should disappear, that certain memories should be refreshed regarding what did and didn't happen during youth programs. The battle lines were being drawn invisibly, two forces marshaling for conflict that would determine whether truth or institutional preservation would prevail. Bishop von Mulhausen's response arrived within 2 days, unusually swift, suggesting that Kellerman's reputation had carried weight. The bishop would grant audience in Halberstadt itself, at the town hall rather than church property, in 3 days' time. The venue choice was significant. Neutral ground, civil rather than ecclesiastical space, suggesting von Mulhausen understood the political sensitivity of whatever accusations were coming. Those 3 days became a race against time. Kellerman and Matthias worked frantically to identify and approach other victims. The process was agonizing. Many slammed doors in their faces, their terror of exposure outweighing any desire for justice. Parents were hostile, interpreting inquiries about their children's interactions with Father Bingelhelm as slanderous insinuation. But slowly, painfully, cracks appeared in the wall of silence. Anna Dietrich's mother, who had noticed her daughter's dramatic personality change, agreed to speak privately with Kellerman. When the scholar described the pattern he'd observed across multiple children, something in her expression shifted. "The washing," she said quietly. "Anna washes her hands until they bleed. I thought it was some kind of nervous condition. But if you're saying..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she agreed to bring Anna to the bishop's audience. The Weber twins proved more challenging. Their father, a stern craftsman with rigid views about discipline and obedience, initially threatened violence against anyone suggesting impropriety involving his sons and the church. But when Kellerman mentioned specific dates from the journal, dates that corresponded to dramatic behavioral changes in the twins, doubt infiltrated the man's certainty. "If there's truth to this," he said finally, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, "if someone hurt my boys and I didn't protect them because I was too busy beating them for the symptoms, God help me, God help us all." The twins would attend the audience. By the day of the bishop's arrival, Kellerman had assembled testimony from 8 victims, ages ranging from 11 to 17. 8 voices that individually might be dismissed but together formed a chorus impossible to ignore. 8 children who had found, in each other's confirmation of shared experience, enough courage to speak the unspeakable. The town hall's main chamber had been prepared for the audience, and word had spread through Halberstadt that something significant was occurring. The hall filled with curious citizens, church officials, town leaders, everyone sensing drama but few understanding its true nature. Father Bingelhelm arrived with his own contingent, fellow priests who vouched for his character, parents of children who described him as a blessing to the community, town elders who testified to his years of devoted service. He looked calm, sorrowful even, the picture of a good man forced to defend himself against baseless accusations. His performance was masterful, the slight tremor in his voice suggesting hurt rather than guilt, his body language open and undefensive. Bishop von Mulhausen was a tall man with a face that looked carved from granite, eyes that missed nothing. He had survived the Reformation's religious wars by being politically astute and morally flexible, but Kellerman had heard rumors that von Mulhausen drew lines around the exploitation of children, that Lutheran though he now was, some Catholic virtues remained. The proceedings began formally, with Kellerman presenting his case. The stolen journal, Matthias's testimony, the pattern of behavioral changes across multiple children, the structural elements that had enabled systematic abuse. He spoke for nearly an hour, methodically building his case while Bingelhelm's supporters grew increasingly restless, muttering about slander and Protestant attacks on Catholic clergy. Then the victims testified. Matthias went first, his voice shaking but steady, describing in clinical detail what Father Bingelhelm had done to him starting at age 13. He explained the grooming process, the use of confession as reconnaissance, the threats that ensured silence, the religious language that framed abuse as spiritual education. The room's atmosphere shifted. The muttering stopped. People began to truly listen, perhaps for the first time hearing what they'd been trained not to hear. Anna Dietrich spoke next, her mother standing beside her with a hand on her shoulder. Her testimony was shorter, broken by tears, but it corroborated Matthias's description of methodology. The same pattern. Confession used to identify vulnerability, isolation through special attention, gradual escalation of inappropriate contact, enforcement of silence through shame and religious authority. The Weber twins testified together, their voices overlapping as they described the monastery retreats, the group dynamics Bingelhelm had exploited, the way he'd made them complicit in each other's abuse to ensure mutual silence. Their father stood behind them, his face carved with anguish, and when they finished speaking he looked at Father Bingelhelm with murder in his eyes. 5 more victims followed. Each testimony added detail to the emerging picture, filled in gaps in the timeline, confirmed elements from the journal's coded entries. The weight of accumulated testimony became crushing, undeniable, a mountain of corroborating evidence that even the most skeptical observer couldn't dismiss as coordinated fabrication. Through it all, Bishop von Mulhausen sat silent, his expression unreadable. He took notes occasionally, but mostly just listened, his gaze moving between the testifying victims and Father Bingelhelm's increasingly strained composure. When the testimonies concluded, the bishop called for a brief recess. The hall erupted into chaos, some voices defending Bingelhelm, insisting this must be Protestant conspiracy, but others expressing horror, doubt, the beginnings of belief that fought against everything they'd been taught about trusting religious authority. During the recess, von Mulhausen examined the journal himself, spending long minutes studying the coded entries while Kellerman provided translation. The bishop's face remained impassive, but something in his posture shifted. A tightening of shoulders, a rigidity that suggested controlled fury. When proceedings resumed, von Mulhausen did something unexpected. He called Father Bingelhelm forward to testify under oath, with the explicit warning that lying in this venue would constitute perjury before both church and civil authority. Bingelhelm rose smoothly, his mask still intact. He began his defense with wounded dignity. These were confused children, misinterpreting innocent pastoral care through the lens of adolescent sexuality. He was being persecuted for his devotion, targeted by Protestant reformers seeking to undermine Catholic authority. The journal was either fabricated or misunderstood. Private theological notes coded for personal reasons, nothing more sinister. His performance was convincing. Several observers nodded along, wanting to believe, desperately needing to believe that their trust hadn't been so catastrophically misplaced. Then Bishop von Mulhausen asked a single question that demolished everything. "Can you explain, Father Bingelhelm, why your theological notes include measurements?" Silence fell like a blade. "Measurements," Bingelhelm repeated, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly. "Physical measurements of children's bodies," von Mulhausen clarified, his voice cold as winter stone. "Recorded with the same precision one might use for livestock. Heights, weights, anatomical details that serve no theological purpose whatsoever. Unless you can explain how such information relates to spiritual education." Bingelhelm's mouth opened, closed. His mind, so agile at manipulation, failed to produce an explanation that wouldn't damn him further. The bishop continued, relentless now. "And the trophies, the locks of hair, the personal items taken from children and hidden in your chambers. What theological purpose did these serve?" The mask was disintegrating, revealing the predator underneath. Bingelhelm's eyes, which had maintained careful, sorrowful softness, now showed something else. Calculation, anger, the realization that his carefully constructed defense was collapsing. He began, then stopped. His legal mind recognized the trap. Anything he said now would either be obvious lie or damning admission. Bishop von Mulhausen stood, and his voice when he spoke carried the weight of ecclesiastical authority. "Father Simon Bingelhelm, by the power vested in me as regional bishop, I hereby remove you from all pastoral duties pending full investigation of these accusations. You are confined to supervised quarters and forbidden contact with any minors. Furthermore, I am ordering a complete audit of St. Martin's Church operations, particularly any programs involving youth." He turned to address the assembled crowd. "Let this be clear to everyone present. If these accusations prove true, and the evidence suggests they are, then we face not just the crime of one man but the institutional failure that enabled him. The Reformation happened because the Church forgot that its purpose is protecting the vulnerable, not the powerful. That failure ends here." The room erupted again, but this time the tenor was different. Parents were pulling their children close, looking at them with new eyes, asking questions they should have asked years ago. Church officials were pale, recognizing that their comfortable assumptions about institutional integrity had shattered. And Father Bingelhelm stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. Matthias Brenner, observing from the side of the hall, felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not happiness, the trauma was too deep, too permanent for happiness. But perhaps vindication, perhaps the knowledge that his choice to speak, to break the silence despite every instinct screaming at him to stay quiet, had mattered. The following weeks brought the full reckoning. Additional victims emerged once the initial dam broke. Children who had suffered in silence for years suddenly finding permission to speak. Adults who had been victimized in their youth and carried the scars into adulthood. The numbers grew horrifying. 50 confirmed victims, then 70, then over 100. And these were only the ones who came forward, who had survived, who could bear to speak about their trauma. The investigation expanded beyond Bingelhelm himself to the systems that had enabled him. The monastery where the retreats occurred was raided, revealing evidence of broader abuse networks. Several other clergy were implicated, arrested, defrocked. The institutional rot ran deeper than anyone had wanted to acknowledge. Father Simon Bingelhelm was tried in both ecclesiastical and civil courts, a rare dual prosecution that reflected the severity of his crimes. The trial became a public spectacle, attended by crowds that packed the courthouse to overflowing. The proceedings were brutal, forcing victims to recount trauma in excruciating detail, while Bingelhelm's defenders attempted to discredit their testimony. But the evidence was overwhelming. The journal, once decoded, provided documentation of hundreds of incidents. The physical trophies connected Bingelhelm directly to victims. The pattern of testimony, children who had never met each other describing identical grooming techniques, identical threats, identical violations, created a picture too consistent to be fabrication. The court found him guilty on multiple counts: corruption of minors, violation of sacred trust, abuse of ecclesiastical authority. The crimes were so extensive that cataloging them took days. Legal scholars would later estimate that Bingelhelm's confirmed victim count exceeded 300 children over his career, with the true number likely far higher. His defenders evaporated as the trial progressed. Parents who had initially supported him were confronted with evidence that their own children had been victimized. Church officials who had vouched for his character were forced to acknowledge either complicity or catastrophic failure of oversight. When sentencing came, Bingelhelm's composure finally, completely shattered. The urbane priest who had controlled every interaction, who had wielded religion as a weapon of manipulation, broke down completely. He begged for mercy, blamed demonic influence, claimed mental illness, cycled through every excuse and deflection his mind could generate. The judge was unmoved. You weaponized innocence. You transformed faith into trauma. You corrupted the very institution meant to protect souls. There is no mercy sufficient for such betrayal. The sentence was death, unusual for the era even for serious crimes, but the scale and nature of Bingelhelm's predation demanded it. The method would be burning, reserved for the most heinous offenders, those whose crimes carried theological as well as civil dimensions. The execution was scheduled for the town square, a public spectacle meant to provide closure and demonstrate that even religious authority couldn't shield genuine evil. On the morning of execution, Halberstadt gathered en masse. Thousands packed the square, lining streets, filling windows, covering rooftops. The crowd included many of Bingelhelm's victims and their families, some seeking catharsis, others simply needing to witness the end of their nightmare. The condemned man was led to the stake wearing a simple penitent's robe, his hands bound, his face a mask of terror that stood in stark contrast to the controlled facade he'd maintained for decades. Guards positioned him against the wooden post while kindling was stacked around his feet. A priest offered last rites, not Father Bingelhelm's former colleagues, but a Lutheran minister who believed that even monsters deserved the possibility of final redemption, though he harbored no illusions that genuine repentance would emerge at this late hour. Bingelhelm's last words, before the flames began, were neither confession nor apology but a snarling accusation. You created me. Your worship of innocence made it precious. Your trust made it vulnerable. "I am what your system produces." There was terrible truth in his words, even in their self-serving deflection. Bingelhelm hadn't emerged from a vacuum. He had exploited structures specifically designed to create the conditions he'd abused. The unquestioning trust in religious authority, the shame surrounding sexuality, the isolation of confession, the cultural prohibition against children questioning adults. All of these had been tools in his hands. Then the torches were applied to the kindling. What followed was neither quick nor clean. Medieval execution by burning was designed to be prolonged, to provide maximum deterrence through visible suffering. As the flames climbed higher, Bingelhelm's theological defiance transformed into animal screaming, sounds that would haunt witnesses for the remainder of their lives. Matthias Brenner watched from the crowd's edge, his face expressionless. He felt none of the satisfaction he'd imagined. The man burning in the square couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't restore stolen innocence or erase trauma carved into neural pathways. Justice, Matthias was discovering, was cold comfort when the damage was irreversible. The execution took nearly 30 minutes, an eternity of screaming that gradually weakened into moans, then silence. When the flames finally subsided, what remained barely resembled anything human, just charred remnants that would be scattered without ceremony or burial marker. Father Simon Bingelhelm, the priest who had destroyed hundreds of young lives, ceased to exist. But the consequences of his predation would echo through generations. The victims he traumatized would carry their scars into adulthood, into parenthood, some repeating cycles of abuse, others breaking themselves trying to protect their own children from similar harm. The town of Halberstadt would wear the stain of complicity, the knowledge that they'd enabled a monster through willful blindness and reflexive defense of institutional authority. The case became infamous throughout the German states, referenced in theological debates about religious authority, cited in legal proceedings establishing new protections for children, whispered about in cautionary tales. The Thousand Devils of Halberstadt became shorthand for institutional evil, for predation enabled by systems of trust. In the months following the execution, Bishop von Mulhausen implemented sweeping reforms: mandatory oversight for any clergy working with youth, prohibition of private confession for minors without guardian awareness, establishment of reporting structures that bypassed local church hierarchy. Other regions adopted similar measures, recognizing that Bingelhelm's evil had been enabled by structural vulnerabilities that existed throughout the ecclesiastical system. But reforms, however necessary, couldn't heal what had been broken. Matthias Brenner never fully recovered. He lived into his 30s, married briefly, but the trauma resurfaced constantly. Nightmares that destroyed sleep, dissociative episodes that cost him employment, inability to trust authority figures or form healthy relationships. He died young, likely by his own hand, though the records are unclear, another casualty of Bingelhelm's predation whose suffering simply took longer to prove fatal. Many of the other victims followed similar trajectories. Some found measure of peace through testimony, through community with fellow survivors, through the knowledge that speaking truth had prevented future abuse. Others spiraled into addiction, violence, or suicide. The trauma's aftermath proved nearly as destructive as the original abuse. The Halberstadt case stands as historical reminder of predation's mechanics. The grooming, the manipulation, the weaponization of trust and authority. It demonstrates how institutions can become accomplices through structural design, how communities can enable evil through reflexive defense of respected figures, how silence multiplies suffering across generations. Simon Bingelhelm's Thousand Devils weren't supernatural entities, but the accumulated trauma he inflicted, the souls he fractured, the lives he poisoned. Each victim became a carrier of pain that radiated outward, affecting families, relationships, entire communities. The mathematics of abuse are exponential. One predator creates hundreds of direct victims who then struggle to form healthy connections with their own children, partners, communities, cascading trauma across decades. This is why such cases matter beyond their immediate horror. They reveal the architecture of abuse, the systems that enable it, the courage required to break conspiratorial silence. They demonstrate that evil often wears trusted faces, speaks soothing words, hides behind institutional authority. The thousands who gathered to watch Bingelhelm burn thought they were witnessing an ending. Instead, they were witnessing a revelation, the exposure of rot that had been festering invisibly, the beginning of a painful reckoning with complicity and failure. The true horror of the Thousand Devils of Halberstadt wasn't just what one man did, but what an entire system allowed him to do, what a community chose not to see, what centuries of religious structure had made possible. And in the ashes of that execution pyre, mixed with the remains of a monster, were the fragments of innocence that could never be restored, trust that could never be rebuilt, souls that would carry the scars until their own deaths provided the only release from suffering. This is the legacy of Simon Bingelhelm. Not just the crimes he committed, but the reminder that the most dangerous monsters are the ones we invite into our homes, our churches, our children's lives, because we believe that evil always announces itself, always looks threatening, always operates in shadows. Sometimes evil operates in plain sight, wearing robes of authority, speaking words of comfort, smiling gently while devouring souls one confession at a time. And the Thousand Devils? They were never external entities. They were the fragments of a single predator's evil, multiplied across every life he touched, every innocence he destroyed, every child who learned that trust was a trap and that the institutions meant to protect them were collaborators in their suffering. The story ends not with Bingelhelm's death, but with the ongoing struggle of his victims to reclaim their lives from the ruins he created. Some succeeded, many didn't. All carried the mark of what he'd done, invisible scars that never fully healed. This is the truth that history preserves. Monsters are real, they often hold positions of trust, and the systems that should protect the vulnerable frequently protect the predators instead. The Thousand Devils of Halberstadt serves as eternal warning, not about the evil one man can commit, but about the evil communities can enable through willful blindness, institutional loyalty, and the dangerous assumption that authority equals virtue. That warning echoes still, across centuries, into every institution that asks for trust without providing accountability, into every system that values reputation over truth, into every moment when someone sees signs of abuse and chooses silence over difficult confrontation. The devils are always there, waiting for the next opportunity, the next vulnerable victim, the next community too invested in comfortable lies to acknowledge uncomfortable truth. And they will continue claiming victims until we learn the lesson Halberstadt paid so dearly to teach. That protecting the vulnerable requires constant vigilance, institutional skepticism, and the courage to believe children when they finally find the words to describe the unspeakable. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's move on to our final story. Story 4. The Predator Who Became Prey, the Karl Denke Case. Tonight, we follow the smell of roasting meat through a quiet German village, only to discover the butcher was serving his neighbors. For decades, he was the gentleman who sold leather straps and suspenders at the market, the one who offered hot meals to vagrants passing through, the kindly hermit whose chimney always smoked with cooking fires. But when blood seeped through his apartment ceiling in 1924, police discovered that Karl Denke hadn't just been feeding the poor, he'd been feeding on them. This is the story of a man who wore kindness like a second skin while turning human beings into pickled meat, leather belts, and bone buttons. A man whose ledger recorded victims the way a grocer tallies produce, and whose final secret died with him, leaving 30 confirmed murders and possibly hundreds more dissolved into the hunger of a small Silesian town. Welcome to Münsterberg, where the most dangerous predator walked among the flock for 40 years, and no one suspected a thing. Christmas approached Münsterberg in 1924, with the scent of pine and wood smoke curling through narrow cobblestone streets. Snow gathered in the corners of medieval archways. Church bells marked the hours while merchants closed their shops, their breath fogging in the December cold. This Silesian town, now Zebes, Poland, existed as it had for centuries. Predictable, pious, and poor. The Great War had gutted Germany's economy. Inflation turned life savings into worthless paper. Hunger gnawed at even respectable families while vagrants wandered the roads like ghosts, searching for work that didn't exist and charity that had run dry. No one paid attention to the drifters anymore. They came and went like seasonal birds. One day you'd see a hollow-eyed veteran begging near the church. The next day he'd vanished, presumably moved on to the next town, the next slim hope. The transient population flowed through Münsterberg without leaving ripples, without leaving traces, without anyone asking where they went. Karl Denke understood this invisibility. He'd built his entire existence around it. At 64 years old, Denke cut an unremarkable figure through the town square. Average height, graying beard, dark clothing worn threadbare but clean. His eyes held a gentle sadness that made strangers trust him instinctively. He attended church services with Protestant regularity, sang hymns in a pleasant baritone, and nodded respectfully to his neighbors. Everyone knew Denke, or thought they did. The failed farmer who'd lost his land years ago. The quiet bachelor who sold second-hand goods and homemade suspenders at the market. The eccentric who lived alone in a cramped apartment on Stowoa Street, above the Gasthof zum Preußischen Adler, the Prussian Eagle Inn. What made Denke special, what elevated him above mere poverty, was his reputation for charity. While others turned beggars away with harsh words and harder hearts, Karl Denke welcomed them. He stopped vagrants on the street and offered them hot meals. He invited the desperate into his home, promising soup and bread and a warm place to rest. In a time of crushing scarcity, this generosity seemed almost saintly. The town's poor knew him as Vater Denke, Father Denke, the kind man who never forgot what it meant to struggle. The police knew him too, but only as a helpful citizen. Denke served as an unofficial assistant to local law enforcement, identifying transients who passed through town. When authorities needed information about the vagrant population, they consulted him. He kept meticulous records they'd heard. He knew these people, trusted them, fed them. No one questioned why so many of them disappeared. December 21st, 1924, began like any other winter Sunday. Morning church services emptied into the cold afternoon. Families retreated indoors. The streets grew quiet except for the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional rattle of cart wheels. At around 1 o'clock, a coachman named Vincent Olivier encountered a ragged young man near the town center. The vagrant was walking strangely, stumbling, pressing one hand against his head. Blood seeped between his fingers, darkening his already filthy coat. "What happened to you?" Olivier demanded, catching the man's arm. The young man, his name was Gabriel, a homeless laborer from the next district, could barely speak through his panic. "Denke," he gasped. "Karl Denke. He tried to kill me. I was in his house and he attacked me with an axe." Olivier's first instinct wasn't belief but confusion. Kind Father Denke? The church-going suspender salesman? Impossible. But blood didn't lie, and the gash splitting Gabriel's scalp was real enough. The coachman half-carried the wounded man toward the police station, where Patrolman Besner listened to the story with deepening concern. An axe attack, unprovoked violence. Even if the victim was just a vagrant, even if there'd been some misunderstanding, it required investigation. Besner and 2 other officers marched to Denke's apartment, climbing the dark stairway to his second-floor rooms. When Denke answered their knock, he appeared perfectly calm. Surprised, perhaps, but not alarmed. His apartment behind him was neat, organized, almost obsessively clean. "There's been a complaint," Besner explained. "A young man claims you attacked him." Denke's expression shifted through confusion to comprehension to something that might have been resignation. He didn't protest his innocence, didn't demand to know who'd accused him. He simply nodded and reached for his coat. "I'll come with you," he said quietly. The officers escorted him to the station and placed him in a holding cell while they returned to search his apartment. They expected to find evidence of a scuffle, maybe a bloody axe, maybe some explanation for why a reputed Good Samaritan would suddenly brain a homeless man. What they found instead redefined the boundaries of human evil. The apartment itself seemed ordinary at first glance. One main room sparsely furnished. A bed, a table, a stove. Bundles of clothing and leather goods stacked neatly against the walls. Denke's merchandise for market. Jars lined up on shelves. Cooking pots hung from hooks. But then the details began registering wrongly, like a familiar painting viewed from an angle that reveals hidden images beneath the surface. The leather wasn't cowhide. The texture was too fine, too soft, almost supple. Suspenders, belts, straps, shoelaces, all made from something that looked disturbingly like tanned human skin. The officers touched the material with growing horror, recognizing the unmistakable quality of flesh transformed into commodity. The jars on the shelves contained meat, preserved meat floating in brine, packed carefully in earthenware containers. Pounds and pounds of it. The stove held pots with more meat, this batch cooked and cooling. The smell in the apartment, which they'd initially dismissed as ordinary cooking, took on a new dimension. Pork, they'd thought. Denki was cooking pork, but it wasn't pork. They found bones next. Not animal bones, human bones. Skulls, femurs, ribs, some picked clean, others still with tissue attached. The officers discovered them stored in barrels and crates, sorted by type like a butcher organizing inventory. Jawbones stacked together, long bones bundled with twine, spinal columns separated and cataloged. Then they found the ledgers. Denki kept records, beautiful, precise, meticulous records written in elegant script. Names, dates, physical descriptions. But these weren't accounts of business transactions. They were tallies of human beings. The ledgers detailed at least 30 individual people, each entry noting when they'd arrived at Denki's apartment and providing brief descriptions of their appearance and clothing. Some entries dated back years, 1921, 1920, 1918. There were no exit dates, no notes about these people leaving. The records simply stopped after their arrival, replaced by new entries, new names, new dates. Police also discovered identity papers, dozens of them. Identification documents belonging to vagrants, wanderers, the displaced and desperate. People who'd passed through Münsterberg and vanished without anyone noticing, without anyone caring enough to ask why. The apartment's back room revealed more horrors. Cutting tools, knives sharpened to surgical precision. A hacksaw with suspicious stains. Hooks mounted on the ceiling beams, the kind a butcher uses to hang carcasses. The floor had been scrubbed obsessively clean, but luminol would have told its story in glowing bloodstains, years of violence layered into the wood grain. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was how ordinary it all seemed. Denki hadn't created a torture chamber or a theatrical horror show. He'd built an efficient processing system. His apartment functioned as slaughterhouse, butcher shop, and leather tannery. He'd industrialized murder, turning human beings into products with the same care a craftsman brings to any trade. The hanging meat wasn't displayed for shock value, it was food storage. The leather goods weren't trophies, they were inventory. He'd even sold these items at market, meaning the townspeople had been buying accessories made from their missing neighbors for years without knowing it. When officers returned to the police station with their initial findings, they found Karl Denki's cell empty of life. He'd removed his suspenders, possibly made from one of his victims, tied them to the cell bars and hanged himself. His body swayed gently in the drafty holding area, still warm, dead perhaps 15 minutes. He'd waited just long enough to ensure the police would find his collection, then denied them any possibility of testimony, trial, or explanation. The gentle man who'd fed the hungry had taken his final secret with him into the silence, leaving only his ledgers to speak. The monster who'd hunted the invisible people of post-war Germany had escaped justice through the same quiet efficiency he'd brought to murder. But his apartment remained, and the evidence it contained would transform Münsterberg from an anonymous Silesian town into a name synonymous with unthinkable horror. The news spread through the streets like poison gas, choking normal life, making neighbors look at each other with new suspicion. If Karl Denki, respectable, charitable Karl Denki, could be a monster, then anyone could. The foundations of trust crumbled. Parents locked their doors. People remembered meals Denki had offered them and felt their stomachs turn. The vendors at the market who'd stood beside him for years wondered whose skin they'd admired in his leather goods, whose flesh might have fed them in times of desperation when Denki occasionally shared his pork. The police investigation had only just begun, but already one thing was certain. They weren't dealing with a sudden outbreak of violence or a crime of passion. This was systematic, calculated, sustained over years, possibly decades. And the 30 victims documented in his ledgers represented only the ones he'd bothered to record. How many more had there been? How many undocumented murders stretched back into the previous decades when Denke's record-keeping was less meticulous? The vagrants who'd vanished without trace. The wanderers who'd simply failed to arrive at their next destination. Had they all paused in Münsterberg? Had they all met Father Denke with his kind smile and his promise of a hot meal? The apartment on Stowoa Street had become a tomb without bodies, a charnel house where the evidence had been consumed or sold or worn. And at its center stood the image of a man who'd perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, who'd weaponized charity and compassion, turning human kindness into a hunting strategy more effective than any predator in nature had ever evolved. The full scope of Karl Denke's operation emerged gradually, like a photograph developing in chemical bath, each detail sharpening into horrifying focus. As investigators cataloged the contents of his apartment over the following days, they realized they weren't documenting a crime scene. They were inventorying an industry. The meat alone told a staggering story. Forensic examination confirmed what the officers' instincts had screamed. Every jar contained human flesh, carefully preserved in brine. The total weight exceeded 40 pounds, entire human beings reduced to portions, stored like winter provisions. Some pieces had been smoked, others pickled. A few showed signs of cooking, the flesh having been boiled or roasted before storage. Denke had experimented with preservation techniques the way a chef refines recipes, seeking the methods that kept his supply fresh longest. His butchering technique displayed uncomfortable expertise. The bones showed clean cuts, precise separation at the joints. Whoever Denke had been before becoming a killer, he'd learned advanced butchery skills somewhere along the way. The body parts were separated with anatomical knowledge, muscle groups divided along natural lines, organs presumably removed and disposed of separately, bones stripped so efficiently that barely any meat remained attached. This wasn't frenzied hacking. This was practiced craftsmanship. The leather goods presented an even more disturbing puzzle. Police collected dozens of items: suspenders, belts, shoelaces, document wallets, coin purses, all made from tanned human skin. The leather was soft, supple, dyed in various shades. Denke had developed or learned techniques for processing human hide into workable material. The transformation required multiple steps: scraping, curing, treating with chemicals, stretching, conditioning. This wasn't an impulsive serial killer keeping trophies. This was an artisan creating products for sale, and he'd sold them. Investigators interviewed market vendors who'd stood beside Denke for years, selling their vegetables and tools while he offered his leather goods. They remembered customers examining his suspenders, praising their quality, their durability. The leather was unusually fine, they said, softer than pig leather, more flexible than cowhide. Of course it was. It came from human bodies which evolved for flexibility and sensitivity, not the thick protection required by livestock. The thought rippled through the town like an epidemic. How many people wore suspenders that had once been someone's back? How many women carried coin purses made from someone's stomach? The leather goods had been reasonably priced, affordable even for working families. Denke hadn't tried to profit excessively from his craft. He charged fair prices, making his products accessible, ensuring wide distribution throughout the community. The town's collective skin crawled. People burned their suspenders, buried their belts, threw away anything leather they couldn't definitively source to a specific animal. But the psychological contamination couldn't be eliminated so easily. The horror had already been absorbed into daily life. Denke's victims had been worn, carried, used for years before their true origin was revealed. The identity papers provided another layer of tragedy. Each document represented a human being who'd vanished into Denke's apartment and never emerged. Police began the grim task of identification, matching papers to missing persons reports, tracking down families who'd lost touch with wandering relatives years ago. Many victims couldn't be identified at all. In post-war Germany's chaos, countless people existed outside official records. They'd lost their homes, their documentation, their connections to society. They survived on the margins, moving from town to town, invisible to authorities and unmissed when they disappeared. These were the people Denki targeted, the ones whose absence created no ripples, whose deaths generated no investigations. But some victims had families, some had histories, and as those identities emerged from the identity papers, a pattern revealed itself. The victims were almost exclusively male vagrants, though a few women appeared among the documented cases. They ranged in age from young men in their 20s to elderly wanderers in their 60s. What united them was vulnerability. These were people at the absolute bottom of society's ladder. Unemployed veterans still traumatized by trench warfare. Alcoholics who'd lost everything to addiction. Mentally ill individuals wandering without care or supervision. Homeless laborers searching for seasonal work. The categories of people who made society uncomfortable, who were waved away or ignored, who could vanish without creating moral panic. Denki had identified a perfect victim pool. These people were already invisible. Their disappearances were expected, even desired by communities that saw them as burdens. When a vagrant arrived in town and then failed to appear in the next town, no investigation followed. People assumed they'd changed direction, found work, drunk themselves to death in a ditch somewhere. The systemic indifference toward the poor and displaced had created hunting grounds that stretched across Germany, with predators like Denki exploiting the gaps in social consciousness. The ledgers provided the most detailed evidence of Denki's methodology. His entries were brief but revealing. May 12, 1921, Ernst Wiegert, 32 years, from Wrocław, brown coat, no papers. August 7, 1921, unknown, approximately 45 years, war veteran, missing left hand. February 3, 1922, Vinzenz Krauss, 28 years, from Silesia, seeking work. Each entry marked a murder. Each name or description represented someone who'd accepted Denki's invitation for a meal and never left his apartment alive. The dates revealed a relatively consistent pattern, roughly one victim every month or two, with occasional gaps of several months between kills. This wasn't compulsive killing. This was sustainable harvesting, because that's what it was. Harvesting. Denki wasn't killing for psychological satisfaction or sexual gratification, the typical motivations ascribed to serial killers. He was killing for practical purposes. He needed meat. He needed leather. His victims provided both, along with whatever money or valuables they carried. The murders served economic functions in a time of desperate poverty. This utilitarian approach made Denki particularly chilling. His crimes weren't crimes of passion or perversion. They were business decisions. The same cold rationality that guided his butchering technique and tanning process governed his victim selection. He chose targets who provided the maximum return with minimum risk. He processed them efficiently, wasting nothing. He stored the products carefully and sold what he could, keeping the rest for personal use. The apartment's layout supported this industrial interpretation. The main room served as his shop floor, the space where he received victims, killed them, and performed initial butchering. The back room functioned as his processing area, where he cured leather and prepared meat for preservation. The stove cooked both his legitimate meals and his victim-derived provisions. Every piece of furniture, every tool, every jar served his enterprise. He'd optimized his living space for murder the way a factory owner optimizes assembly lines. Investigators tried to determine his killing method. The attack on Gabriel, the axe blow to the head, suggested that was Denki's preferred approach. A sudden, unexpected strike from behind while the victim ate or relaxed. The victim would collapse, unconscious or dead. Then Denki could finish the job without struggle, without noise that might alert neighbors below or on the street. The Gasthof Zune Präcision Adler provided another layer of camouflage. The inn beneath Denki's apartment saw constant activity. Travelers arriving and departing, people eating and drinking, transient populations flowing through. Any unusual sounds from Denki's apartment would blend into the general noise. Any stranger seen entering his door would seem unremarkable in a building that catered to strangers. The location was simultaneously public and private, visible yet overlooked. Neighbors recalled seeing vagrants approach Denke's apartment. They'd assumed he was helping these people, offering charity. Now those memories became evidence of predation. Each vagrant who'd climbed those stairs might have been walking toward death. The same stairs the police climbed to arrest Denke had been traveled by dozens of victims, each thinking they were about to receive kindness. The forensic analysis of the bones provided more disturbing details. Many showed tool marks consistent with defleshing, knife scrapes, saw cuts. Some bore evidence of cooking, discoloration from boiling or roasting. A few showed signs of acid etching, suggesting Denke had attempted to dissolve some remains. The bones represented his waste products, the parts he couldn't use or consume. Everything else had been utilized. Pathologists examining the preserved meat made an unsettling discovery. The flesh showed no signs of disease or malnutrition. Denke hadn't been targeting sick or dying vagrants. He'd selected relatively healthy victims, people who still had enough vitality to travel, to work, to hope for better circumstances. This made sense from his utilitarian perspective. Healthier bodies provided better quality meat and leather. But it added another dimension of tragedy. These weren't people at death's door. These were people who might have recovered, found work, rebuilt their lives if they'd walked past Denke's door instead of accepting his invitation. The investigation expanded beyond the apartment. Police searched the areas around Münsterberg, looking for additional remains. Denke might have dumped waste in remote locations, organs he couldn't use, bones after he'd stripped them clean, victims whose identity papers he hadn't bothered keeping. Search teams combed the forests and fields surrounding the town. They found scattered bones. Human bones mixed with animal remains in places where butchers dumped offal. The bones were old, weathered, impossible to connect definitively to Denke without modern DNA analysis. But their presence suggested his operation had lasted longer than the ledgers indicated. The documented 30 victims might represent only his recent work, the period when he'd grown systematic enough to maintain records. Before that, there might have been years or decades of undocumented killing. Some investigators theorized Denke's career stretched back to before the war. He'd lost his farm in 1910, forced into poverty by bad decisions and debt. His descent into murder might have begun shortly after, driven by hunger and rage at his reduced circumstances. If he'd been killing since 1910, the victim count could easily exceed 100 people. An entire century's worth of disappearances, each one rationalized away, each one attributed to the natural churn of vagrant populations. The psychological profile that emerged was almost more disturbing than the physical evidence. Denke showed no signs of the disorganization typical of serial killers. His apartment was clean, his records meticulous. He functioned socially, maintaining friendly relationships with neighbors and shopkeepers. He attended church regularly, participating in community religious life. By all external measures, he was sane, competent, integrated into society. Yet he'd murdered at least 30 people and cannibalized their remains. He'd turned human skin into commercial products. He'd done this for years without apparent guilt or hesitation. The contradiction suggested something psychiatrists of the era couldn't adequately explain. A person could be simultaneously rational and monstrous, organized and evil, socially functional and utterly inhuman. Modern psychology might diagnose antisocial personality disorder with severe narcissistic features. Denke clearly lacked empathy, viewing other humans as resources rather than beings worthy of moral consideration. But diagnoses don't explain. They label without illuminating the internal landscape that transforms a person into a predator capable of such sustained horror. What did Denke think about as he butchered his victims? Did he feel anything? Satisfaction at a job well done? Relief at replenishing his supplies? Or was it simply routine, mechanical, another day's work? The ledger's dry, factual tone suggested the latter. These weren't excited journal entries or confessional narratives. They were inventory records. The emotional flatness implied murder had become so normalized for Denke that it generated no feelings worth noting. His suicide denied investigators any chance to probe his psychology directly. They could only infer from evidence, constructing theories that would never be confirmed or refuted. The man behind the monster remained opaque, his motivations locked in the silence of death. As the investigation continued, attention shifted from Denki himself to the broader system that had enabled his crimes. How had one man murdered at least 30 people, possibly many more, in a small town without raising suspicion? The answer lay in the systematic dehumanization of Germany's vagrant population in the post-war period. World War I had shattered European society. 8 million soldiers died. 20 million were wounded. The survivors returned to economies destroyed by total war mobilization. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Food shortages created genuine famine conditions. The German Empire collapsed, replaced by the unstable Weimar Republic. Revolution and counter-revolution convulsed the nation. Millions of people were displaced, losing their homes, their livelihoods, their social positions. Into this chaos came the wanderers, veterans who couldn't reintegrate into civilian life, workers whose factories had closed, farmers whose land had been seized or destroyed, mentally ill individuals released from institutions that could no longer care for them, alcoholics and addicts self-medicating against trauma, the roads filled with people moving from place to place, searching for work, for charity, for any opportunity to survive. Towns responded to this population with suspicion and hostility. Vagrants were seen as threats, potential criminals, drains on limited resources, visible reminders of social breakdown. Local authorities created registration systems to track transients, requiring wanderers to report to police when they arrived in town. But enforcement was sporadic. Many vagrants avoided registration, knowing it often led to harassment or forced relocation. They existed in the gaps of official surveillance, visible yet unrecorded. This created perfect conditions for predators like Denki. The vagrant population was simultaneously visible and invisible. Everyone saw them, but no one really looked at them. They were present but unmissed. Their movements were random enough that disappearances seemed like departures. The social infrastructure that might have protected them, family connections, community ties, official documentation, had been destroyed by war and economic collapse. Denki exploited this systemic vulnerability with predatory intelligence. He positioned himself as a friend to vagrants, building a reputation that made potential victims seek him out rather than avoiding him. Word spread through the wandering population. In Münsterberg, there's a kind man named Denki who feeds the hungry. This reputation drew victims directly to his door, eliminating the need for risky hunting behavior. His relationship with local police enhanced his camouflage. By serving as an informal informant about the vagrant population, Denki positioned himself as an ally of law enforcement. Police saw him as helpful, cooperative, trustworthy. When vagrants disappeared, police didn't suspect Denki. They sometimes asked him if he knew where these people had gone. He became part of the investigative process, helping police account for the very people he'd murdered. This role gave Denki access to valuable information. He learned which vagrants had family members searching for them, which disappearances might generate official investigation. He could adjust his victim selection accordingly, targeting people whose absence would create the least disruption. His informal police work essentially allowed him to profile potential victims for vulnerability. The investigation revealed several near misses where Denki's crimes almost came to light. In 1922, a vagrant had escaped from Denki's apartment and reported an assault to police. The man claimed Denki had attacked him without provocation. Police investigated but ultimately dismissed the complaint. The victim was known to be alcoholic, unstable. Denki was a respectable citizen with no criminal record. The case was filed away as a misunderstanding or a delusional accusation. Another near exposure occurred when neighbors complained about odd smells coming from Denki's apartment. Police investigated, asked Denki about the odor. He explained he was cooking pork, curing leather for his products. The explanation satisfied authorities. No further investigation followed. The smells were actually from human remains being processed, but no one considered that possibility. The presumption of innocence, combined with Denki's reputation, created a shield that deflected suspicion. These incidents revealed a consistent pattern. When evidence of Denki's crimes surfaced, social and institutional biases interpreted it in his favor. His status as a respectable resident outweighed complaints from transients. His reputation for charity made accusations seem implausible. The cognitive dissonance between kind Father Denki and axe-murderer was too extreme for people to bridge without overwhelming evidence. Gabriel's escape succeeded where previous victims had failed precisely because he avoided the usual pitfalls. Instead of reporting directly to police, who might have dismissed him as another delusional vagrant, he encountered a third-party witness who saw his injuries immediately. Coachman Olivier's testimony lent credibility that Gabriel alone might not have possessed. The combination forced police to take the complaint seriously enough to arrest Denki and search his apartment. Even then, police almost missed the evidence. The initial search was cursory, looking for weapons and signs of struggle. The officers weren't examining Denki's merchandise critically. It was only after one investigator looked more closely at the leather suspenders, noticing their unusual texture, that suspicion deepened. If that officer had been less observant, if the team had conducted a quick search and left, Denki might have been released after questioning. Gabriel's injuries could have been dismissed as resulting from a misunderstanding or self-defense. The killing would have continued. This narrow escape highlighted systemic failures in protecting vulnerable populations. The criminal justice system of Weimar Germany, like most systems before and since, allocated protection based on social status. Crimes against respectable citizens triggered serious investigations. Crimes against vagrants were treated as low priority, often not investigated at all. This two-tiered justice created hunting grounds for predators smart enough to recognize the opportunity. Denki wasn't unique in exploiting this dynamic. Research into his case eventually connected him to a broader pattern of predation against vagrant populations across Europe. In France, Joseph Wacker murdered at least 11 vagrants and shepherds between 1894 and 1897. In Hungary, Béla Kiss allegedly murdered at least 24 people during World War I. In multiple countries, there were reports of vagrants disappearing near certain towns or along specific routes, creating dead zones that the wandering population learned to avoid. What made Denki exceptional was the duration and scale of his operation. He killed for at least a decade, possibly much longer. He maintained his facade so successfully that he became a trusted community member. And he industrialized his crimes, creating an efficient system for murder, butchery, and disposal that maximized utility while minimizing risk. The interviews with Münsterberg residents revealed how thoroughly Denki had integrated into community life. People remembered him as quiet but pleasant. He helped neighbors with small tasks. He donated to church causes. Children weren't afraid of him. He sometimes gave them small treats or toys he'd made. The profile fit a harmless eccentric, not a serial murderer. But beneath this facade, residents now recalled disturbing details. Denki always had meat when others were hungry. His leather goods never ran out, even when animal hides were expensive and scarce. He sometimes smelled of chemicals and blood, which he attributed to his leatherworking. His apartment door was always locked, even when he was home. He discouraged visitors, claiming his space was too messy or that he was working on projects. These red flags seemed obvious in retrospect, but in real time they'd been rationalized away. Denki was frugal, lucky in his supply sources, a skilled craftsman who worked with smelly materials. His privacy was unremarkable for a bachelor. Every suspicious detail had an innocent explanation that people accepted because the alternative, that their neighbor was a cannibalistic serial killer, was unthinkable. The psychological toll on Münsterberg was severe. Residents struggled with guilt, wondering if they could have prevented the murders by being more observant. They experienced paranoia, suddenly suspicious of all neighbors. The social fabric frayed as trust evaporated. Churches held special services for the victims' souls and for the community's healing. But forgiveness and recovery proved elusive. How do you forgive yourself for eating beside a cannibal at church suppers? For buying products made from murder victims? For praising a monster's generosity? Some families left Münsterberg entirely, unable to continue living in the town where such horror had unfolded. Others remained but avoided discussing the case, treating it as shameful family secret rather than community tragedy. The town's reputation never recovered. Münsterberg became synonymous with Denke's crimes in German popular culture, a byword for hidden horror and betrayed trust. The victims' families faced their own trauma. Many learned about their relatives' deaths years after the fact, when police matched identity papers to missing persons reports. The delay added layers of pain. Not only had their loved ones died horribly, but they'd spent years hoping these people were still alive somewhere. The truth destroyed hope retroactively, poisoning memories of the vanished relatives' last visit, last letter, last goodbye. For families of unidentified victims, the pain was different but equally profound. They knew their missing relatives might be among Denke's victims, but without confirmation, they couldn't achieve closure. The uncertainty haunted them. Their loved ones existed in a liminal state, possibly dead, possibly still wandering, possibly victims of a monster or possibly victims of lesser tragedies. The inability to mourn properly, to hold funerals, to mark graves, created lasting psychological damage. The broader vagrant community reacted with terror and rage. News of Denke's crimes spread through the networks of travelers, passed along roads and in shelters, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting help. The case reinforced existing paranoia about settled society, confirming the suspicion that respectable citizens viewed vagrants as less than human. If a man like Denke, praised for his charity, could murder and eat dozens of people without consequence until near the end, what did that say about how society valued vagrant lives? Some advocacy groups attempted to use the case to push for better protections for homeless populations. They argued that Denke's crimes demonstrated the need for official shelters, better documentation systems, regular check-ins to verify vagrant welfare. These proposals mostly failed. The economic crisis of Weimar Germany left little room for expanding social services. And the underlying prejudice that had enabled Denke's crimes, the view of vagrants as burdensome, disposable, undeserving, remained largely unchanged. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about cannibalism during the post-war hunger period. Denke wasn't the only German cannibal of the era. Fritz Haarmann, the butcher of Hanover, murdered at least 27 young men between 1918 and 1924, allegedly selling their flesh as pork on the black market. Karl Grossmann murdered at least 3 women in Berlin, possibly many more, and was suspected of selling human flesh to restaurants. These cases emerged from the same context of starvation and social breakdown. Cannibalism became a survival strategy for some predators, a way to solve both the problem of disposal and the problem of hunger. The taboo against consuming human flesh, one of humanity's strongest and most universal prohibitions, eroded under pressure of genuine famine. Not for everyone, of course. Most Germans starved rather than turned to cannibalism. But for individuals already divorced from empathy, already viewing other humans as resources rather than beings, the final barrier collapsed easily. Denke's meat preservation suggested he'd been eating human flesh regularly, probably for years. The quantity preserved exceeded what one person could consume quickly, implying he'd developed a taste for it, that human meat had become his normal food source. Some scholars speculate he preferred it, finding human flesh superior to available alternatives. But this remains speculation. Denke left no written reflections on his diet, no gustatory journal entries. His feelings about consuming his victims died with him. Karl Denke's suicide denied the world its traditional narrative closure. There would be no trial, no confession, no psychological examination that might explain how a human being becomes what he became. But his legacy extended far beyond the immediate horror of his crimes, reshaping criminology, exposing societal failures, and leaving questions that still haunt forensic psychology a century later. The ledgers became the primary window into Denke's mind. Experts pored over his handwriting, analyzing the entries for psychological insight. The script was neat, controlled, almost elegant, the writing of an educated man with steady hands and methodical temperament. There were no emotional flourishes, no exclamation points or underlining. Each entry maintained the same dispassionate tone, describing human beings with the clinical detachment of a warehouse manager noting inventory. What disturbed analysts most was the progression of detail over time. Early entries were sparse, sometimes just dates with vague descriptions. November 1920 unknown vagrant, approximately 40 years. Later entries grew more specific, including names when available, physical descriptions, clothing details, places of origin. This evolution suggested Denki was refining his system, becoming more organized as he gained experience. The ledgers weren't just records. They were evidence of professional development, a killer perfecting his craft. Some entries included chilling annotations. Next to certain names, Denki had marked small symbols, dots, crosses, numbers that might have indicated weight or quality of meat obtained. These notations reduced human beings to their component resources, each life translated into pounds of usable material. One entry noted a victim was particularly thin, another that a man had good leather. The commodification was absolute. Handwriting experts noted that Denki's script never wavered, never showed signs of stress or emotional disturbance. Even entries made immediately before or after murders maintained perfect consistency. This suggested his crimes generated no internal conflict, no anxiety or guilt that might cause his hand to shake or his writing to deteriorate. The psychological steadiness was perhaps more disturbing than any amount of frenzy would have been. Denki killed with the same calm focus other men brought to bookkeeping or gardening. The investigation team attempted to match ledger entries to missing persons reports, but the task proved nearly impossible. Most of Denki's victims existed outside official records. Many used false names or nicknames. Physical descriptions were too generic. Brown hair, average height, could apply to thousands of men. The identity papers Denki kept sometimes didn't match the ledger entries, suggesting he mixed up documents or simply grabbed whichever papers were convenient. Only 6 victims were definitively identified through family recognition of personal effects or unique identifying features mentioned in the ledgers. 6 names recovered from the void: Ernst Wiegert, Vinzenz Krauss, Anna L., Robert Kubich, Johann Steiner, Paul Nisch. Each name carried a story: a family searching, a life interrupted, a person reduced to preserved meat and leather goods. The remaining 24 documented victims remained anonymous, their identities lost forever, but investigators strongly suspected the true victim count far exceeded 30. The ledgers only covered recent years. What about the decade before Denki started keeping systematic records? What about victims he killed but didn't bother documenting? The amount of leather goods in his possession suggested he'd processed far more bodies than the ledgers indicated. A single human body provides limited usable leather, perhaps enough for a dozen suspender sets at most. Yet Denki's inventory contained hundreds of items. Forensic analysis of the leather goods revealed they were different ages. Some items showed significant wear, suggesting they'd been made years earlier. The oldest pieces dated to at least 1915, possibly earlier. If Denki had been creating human leather products since World War I, and if each victim provided material for roughly 10 to 15 items, then the inventory suggested at least 60 to 80 bodies, possibly more than 100. The bone fragments found in dump sites around Münsterberg supported this higher estimate. While individual bones couldn't be definitively linked to Denki, the quantity exceeded what 30 bodies would produce. Forensic anthropologists estimated the scattered remains represented at least 50 individuals, possibly 70 or more. Combined with the leather goods evidence and the gaps in Denki's ledgers, investigators concluded the actual death toll likely ranged between 60 and 100 victims, with some extreme estimates reaching as high as 150. This would make Denki one of history's most prolific serial killers, operating successfully for 10 to 15 years without detection. The scale was staggering. He'd murdered more people than Jack the Ripper, more than most infamous killers of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet he'd remained invisible, protected by the social dynamics that rendered his victims worthless in the eyes of society. The criminological implications fascinated emerging forensic disciplines. Denki didn't fit the profile of serial killers established by early criminal psychology. He wasn't sexually motivated like many murderers. He didn't keep elaborate trophies or seek fame. He didn't taunt police or engage in psychological games. His crimes served practical, utilitarian purposes: food, leather, money from selling goods, and from his victims' pockets. This pragmatic motivation challenged assumptions about why people commit serial murder. Most early theories emphasized psychological compulsion, sexual deviance, or sadistic pleasure. Denke suggested a different category: the practical killer motivated by resource acquisition rather than psychological need. This raised disturbing questions about how many other Denkes might exist. People who kill simply because it's useful, who murder for profit or sustenance rather than psychological satisfaction. Modern profilers studying the case note that Denke displayed characteristics of antisocial personality disorder combined with extreme narcissism. He lacked empathy, completely viewing other humans as objects. He felt entitled to take what he needed without regard for others' rights or lives. He showed no remorse, no anxiety about his crimes. The suicide itself wasn't motivated by guilt but by pragmatism. He'd been caught, his system destroyed, so he eliminated himself with the same efficiency he'd applied to everything else. But diagnoses don't explain origins. What transformed Karl Denke from a struggling farmer into a cannibal serial killer? His early life offered few clues. Born in 1860 in the village of Kunzendorf, Denke grew up in a farming family of modest means. He received basic education, learned farming, showed no signs of violence or criminal behavior as a youth. At age 25, he inherited a farm from his father but proved an incompetent manager. He accumulated debts, made bad investments, finally lost the property in 1910. This failure marked a turning point. The proud farmer became a vagrant himself, wandering for several years before settling in Münsterberg around 1910 to 1912. He lived in poverty, taking odd jobs, eventually accumulating enough money to rent the apartment on Stowoa Street. Somewhere during this period of humiliation and desperation, something broke inside him. Or perhaps something was always broken, waiting for circumstances to reveal it. One theory suggests Denke's first murder was impulsive, driven by hunger and rage. Perhaps a vagrant insulted him, triggering violence. Afterward, facing a corpse and desperately hungry, he made the transgressive decision to consume his victim. The experience, getting away with murder, solving his food problem, might have revealed a new possibility. What had seemed unthinkable became practical. Subsequent murders grew easier as the taboo eroded. Another theory posits that Denke had always possessed violent impulses but lacked opportunity while farming under his family's watchful eyes. The anonymity of urban poverty freed him to act on latent predatory instincts. The first murder might have been calculated rather than impulsive, a deliberate decision to solve multiple problems: hunger, poverty, rage at his reduced circumstances, through one transgressive act. We'll never know. Denke's internal landscape remains opaque. His suicide note, if he wrote one, was never found or was suppressed by authorities. His neighbors remembered no confessions or suspicious statements. He died keeping his secrets, leaving only physical evidence to speak for him. The public response to the case revealed deep anxieties about modernity and social breakdown. Newspapers sensationalized the story, calling Denke the cannibal of Münsterberg and the monster of Silesia. Some coverage emphasized the horror, describing his crimes in gruesome detail that both titillated and terrified readers. Other coverage focused on social critique, arguing the case demonstrated Weimar Germany's moral collapse. Conservative commentators blamed the case on post-war godlessness and erosion of traditional values. They pointed to Denke's church attendance as evidence that even religious observance couldn't prevent moral decay in a society that had abandoned authentic faith. Progressive commentators blamed economic inequality and inadequate social services, arguing that better support for vagrant populations would have prevented the murders. Both interpretations missed crucial aspects. Denke wasn't a product of moral decay or economic collapse alone. He was an individual with profound psychological abnormalities who recognized and exploited systemic vulnerabilities. The post-war crisis created opportunities for predators, but it didn't create the predators themselves. People like Denke exist in every era. What varies is their ability to operate successfully based on social conditions and institutional responses. The case influenced emerging forensic practices. Police departments began developing better systems for tracking vagrant populations, not out of compassion but from recognition that transients' invisibility created opportunities for crime. Missing persons protocols improved slightly, with authorities paying more attention to reports involving homeless individuals. The changes were modest and inconsistently applied, but they represented incremental progress. Denke's apartment was eventually demolished, the building torn down to eliminate the physical reminder of horror. The site remained vacant for years, locals avoiding it as cursed ground. Eventually, new construction covered the location, but the address retained its dark reputation. Even today, residents of the area sometimes mention the history in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might reawaken old evil. The ledgers and physical evidence were preserved in police archives, later transferred to forensic museums. The leather goods presented an ethical dilemma. Should human remains fashioned into products be displayed for educational purposes or destroyed as sacred remains requiring burial? Ultimately, most items were destroyed or placed in restricted archives accessible only to researchers. A few pieces were retained for forensic study, stored in conditions that preserved them while respecting their origin. The preserved meat was destroyed entirely, incinerated to ash. No scientific value justified retaining human flesh that had been pickled for consumption. The destruction was conducted with some ceremony. Religious officials present to offer prayers for the victims' souls. The ashes were buried in unmarked graves, giving Denke's victims at least this small dignity. The case entered German folklore and international true crime history. Writers, journalists, and eventually filmmakers retold Denke's story, each iteration adding layers of interpretation and speculation. Some accounts embellished details, claiming Denke sold human meat to restaurants or served human flesh to dinner guests. These sensationalized versions weren't supported by evidence, but they proliferated anyway, the truth being insufficient for popular appetite for horror. Academic studies examined the case from multiple angles. Criminologists analyzed Denke's methods and victim selection. Sociologists explored the social conditions that enabled his crimes. Psychologists debated his motivations and mental state. Historians contextualized the murders within post-war Germany's broader chaos. Each discipline found different lessons, different warnings in the story. For criminology, Denke demonstrated the importance of attending to crimes against marginalized populations. His success depended entirely on society's indifference to vagrant welfare. When authorities treated transient lives as valuable, when communities monitored vulnerable populations with care rather than suspicion, predators like Denke found their hunting grounds constrained. For psychology, the case illustrated how normal surface behavior could coexist with profound moral pathology. Denke wasn't a raving lunatic or an obviously disturbed individual. He functioned effectively in social contexts, maintained relationships, performed complex tasks requiring planning and organization. The monster wore a completely convincing human disguise, detectable only through careful attention to subtle inconsistencies. For society broadly, the case served as a dark mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about whose lives matter and whose disappearances generate concern. The victims were murdered not just by Denke, but by systemic indifference that rendered them invisible. Every person who dismissed vagrant complaints about Denke, every police officer who filed away suspicions without investigation, every neighbor who didn't question where his meat came from, all participated passively in enabling the crimes. This collective responsibility was difficult to acknowledge. It was easier to focus on Denke as an individual monster, an aberration rather than a symptom. But the truth was more disturbing. Denke succeeded because he understood his society's blind spots and operated within them. He wasn't an alien presence but a native predator, evolved to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of post-war German social organization. The case raises a final, haunting question. How many other Denkes existed? How many small-town predators operated in similar obscurity, targeting similar victims, never caught because their victims never mattered enough to prompt serious investigation? The vagrant populations of Europe in the 1920s numbered in the millions. The documented serial killers numbered in the dozens. But how many undocumented killers operated in the gaps? their crimes invisible because their victims were invisible. We know about Denki only because Gabriel escaped and found a credible witness. Without that chance event, Denki might have continued killing for years more, perhaps dying peacefully of old age with his crimes undiscovered. How many others did exactly that? How many elderly men died with dark secrets, their apartments cleaned out by unsuspecting relatives who never looked closely at the leather goods or questioned where grandfather got his meat during the hungry years? These questions admit no comfortable answers. The archive of human cruelty extends beyond documented cases into vast darkness where countless crimes remain forever hidden. We see only what comes to light, a small fraction of what occurs. Karl Denke's ledger documented 30 souls. The true ledger, accounting for all his victims over all his years, was burned with his brain when he hanged himself in that cell. But perhaps the largest ledger belongs not to Denke but to the society that enabled him. That ledger would document every vagrant dismissed, every complaint ignored, every disappearance rationalized. It would tally the systemic failures that turned human beings into prey. It would count not just Denke's victims, but all the victims of all the predators who recognized that some lives could be taken without consequence. That ledger has never been written. The names within it remain lost, forgotten, erased from history as thoroughly as Denke erased his victims. They exist now only as absences, as gaps in family trees, as questions without answers. They were the invisible people, the ones society didn't see even when they stood directly in front of us, asking for help, extending their hands toward kindness that concealed an axe. Karl Denke understood that invisibility. He weaponized it, and for at least a decade, he harvested souls in plain sight while respectable society looked away, unwilling to see what lay beneath the mask of charity, unwilling to acknowledge that monsters don't always announce themselves with fangs and claws. Sometimes they offer you a warm meal and a place to rest. Sometimes they wear suspenders made from the last person who accepted that invitation. And sometimes, long after they're gone, their ledger remains, a testament to both individual evil and collective blindness, a warning written in careful script, documenting the terrible efficiency with which human beings can be transformed into resources when society decides some lives don't matter enough to count. The investigation officially closed in 1925. The case file was archived. Munsterberg tried to forget, but the dead remember, and in the silence between heartbeats, their names still wait to be spoken. Their stories still wait to be told. Their humanity still waits to be acknowledged. 30 confirmed victims, possibly 100 or more. Each one was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. Each one deserves more than being reduced to a line in a monster's ledger. Each one deserves to be remembered not as victims of Karl Denke, but as human beings whose lives had value, whose deaths diminished us all, and whose forgotten names stand as permanent accusation against any society that allows some people to become invisible. That is the final, enduring horror of the Karl Denke case. Not just what he did, but how easily he was allowed to do it. Thanks for joining us as we delved into these chilling and mysterious tales. If you enjoyed the journey, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with fellow mystery lovers. We'd also love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in. We truly appreciate you being part of this community, and we'll catch you next time with more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep uncovering the unknown.